Adrian, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you could help manage the door, and we'll just have the chimes going in the background as we get everybody on board. So I want to welcome all of you to this afternoon's workshop, FRHTH seminar series workshop on making the grade, a workshop on improving electricity transmission. I'm Dr. Michael Sykuta. I'm Executive Director of the Financial Research Institute at the University of Missouri. The FRI has been around about 30 years, and our mission is to try and help facilitate more effective policymaking through providing a neutral environment for stakeholders and regulated public utility industries to come together to examine, understand, and debate current issues relating to public utility policy. Today's topic is part of what we have as our usual hot topic hotline webinar series, which is typically a 1-hour webinar discussion of folks around a particular topic. And as we were planning this afternoon's workshop, we were discussing the need to have a conversation about transmission and realized, we really can't make a dent in that in an hour's time. And that it might be more productive to do something we've not done before and do a half-day workshop like this one. And we appreciate you all being here today. One of the things that's unique, I think, about the workshop we have planned today is that you're all going to be participants at one point, if we can get you to do that. We're going to have a variety of conversation from different perspectives, and some of that will be, I suspect, some examination, some debate, and hopefully some understanding. And at the end, toward the end of today's workshop, the ultimate goal of this program is to break into some small groups, have more detailed discussion with all of our participants about, how do we move this ball forward? As we've been planning this event, we've been talking with all of our speakers, and our desire is not to just rehash the kind of the expected conversation that we would expect to hear from the different voices in the different parts of the industry, to just hear presentations about what all the problems are and what all the challenges are, and pointing of fingers between interested groups. What we really want to walk away from today with is a start at some actionable steps. What are some barriers that are in the way of improving our grid system, whether that's planning, whether that's market design, whether that's various types of other policy related issues? Where are the barriers in these processes that are keeping us from developing the grid that different folks would argue that we need? And so that's our ultimate goal today. We're going to have some speakers, some panel discussion, and then we'll have our small group breakouts. Just as a little bit of administrative work, we don't have a lot of time scheduled in terms of taking a break. We're going to keep this moving throughout the day. We will have limited time for question and answers during the earlier presentations and the panels. We're going to try and save most of that for the group discussions at the end. We will have a little bit of time in each of our sessions if there are clarifying questions that are kind of pressing questions that need to be asked to clarify a point rather than to debate an issue or to debate a topic. We'll try and have a little bit of time for that, but our goal really is to have most of that conversation in the context of the small groups. I will ask all of you to keep your cameras and microphones turned off throughout the day, except during the small breakout groups. You might want to turn your cameras on then to be able to see who you're talking with. But in order to facilitate the breakout groups, we have to do this as a meeting rather than a webinar. So I would just ask that you kindly keep your cameras and microphones muted so that it doesn't disrupt the panelists and the speakers that we have lined up today. We do have, in terms of our agenda, I'll post into the chat, if I can pull that up, the link to today's program website so that you can follow along with the agenda, the timeline, the list of speakers. Each of our speakers will be introduced as we get to their section of the program. But you can keep an eye there as to where we are on our agenda and what the plans are for the afternoon. Registering this a few minutes early, we're going to jump toward our first speaker before I introduce her. As our planning group was starting to discuss this program earlier this summer or late in the summer, the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid had just released their grid grade report. And we thought that this might be a touch point for conversation. And I recognize that not everybody is at this point. This report has been the subject of some discussion and some differing opinions. This is just one of many reports about the health of the grid. The Department of Energy came out with his 2023 grid needs assessment report just earlier this week, and may have a different take on this, and that may be part of the conversation that we go through today, is the different perspectives of what's needed in terms of our grid system. How do we understand it? How do we evaluate it? As an instructor, I know anytime you create a rubric, there's going to be problems with the rubric. And so our goal today is not necessarily to argue or critique a particular rubric, but to really have a discussion and to have a starting point for that conversation. To launch our conversation today, we've invited Christina Hayes from the Americans for the Clean Energy Grid to share about their report and how they got to the conclusions they got to. And then we'll have industry panels and regulator panels that in part respond to that, but in also kind of move the conversation forward from there, using that as a starting point. Christina is executive director of ASEG, a diverse coalition of independent and utility transmission developers, clean energy customers, renewable resource developers, environmental advocates, grid technology developers, and labor unions supporting the development of high capacity transmission to cost effectively and reliably build out the U.S. grid system. She previously served as vice president for federal regulatory affairs for Berkshire Hathaway Energy, as well as an attorney for FERC, where she served as an advisor to Chairman Wellinghoff. A native Oregonian, Christina also served as an administrative law judge at the Public Utility Commission of Oregon. So Christina, welcome. We appreciate you being with us today to kick off this conversation. And I will turn the screen over to you as soon as I can unshare my screen here. And we will let you carry on with the show.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And appreciate any patience with technical difficulties we may have. Does this work as a slideshow?
It's not showing as a slideshow yet.
It's not? Okay. Then let's try it a different way. How's that?
There you go. That works.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. What a great introduction. We'll be honest that this report card that came out in June is focused very much on planning and deployment of transmission. I certainly appreciate that there are challenges in operating the system. There's a lot that goes into operating a well-oiled grid, pardon the pun. And so appreciate your group thinking about all the aspects of it. This is one piece of the puzzle. We think, frankly, it's a piece that could be a bit better developed. So really excited to have this conversation, especially going into NARUC next week and other events where transmission's coming up. It's really an exciting time in the field. First, I wanted to level set that well-planned transmission is critical to reliably and cost-effectively develop the grid for new load and new resources. Without it, customers bear the consequences in the form of higher costs, lost economic opportunities, and dangerous outages. Progress has slowed in recent years, and it is on us to improve. I know there are a lot of folks waiting for FERC to issue their final rule, but there's certainly a lot of things that can be done in the meantime. A well-planned grid is cost-effective. Geographic diversity of resources with unconstrained transmission. We had a recent study that showed increasing transmission capability between regions can unlock something like 137 gigawatts of capacity. And if you price that at, the cost of CCTs, natural gas CCTs, it's about the cost of $113 billion. And so transmission can unlock a lot of access to generation. One analysis of transforming the grid by using transmission to access low-cost resources shows it can decrease the average electric bill from 9 cents per kilowatt hour over 10 years to 6 watts per kilowatt hour, or a savings of about $300 per year for your average customer. And that's before we get to emergency events and interregional transmission. So in terms of speaking to reliability, there was a recent NRDC and General Electric study simulating recent extreme events, forecasting what they would be in the future. Replicating a model heat wave showed outages of 600,000 meters in New York City and 140,000 folks in DC. And so significant cost to consumers, 875 million due to loss of load. And then a similar polar vortex showed something like 2 million customers going out and $1 billion in economic costs. So that's a hypothetical. And then if we look to actual examples, Winter Storm Uri cost something like $195 billion in Texas due to blackouts. Winter Storm Elliott, ACOR had a study that showed something like an extra gigawatt of transfer capability in a few select places would have added up to $100 million in benefits. So real money is involved. For all these reliability events, for instance, we know that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is currently doing a study on interregional transfer capacity and the value it could bring in reliability events. It's helpful to remember that reliability events also have an economic component. And so a well-planned transmission grid, if we think about, for instance, an interstate highway for our electrical system, provides significant benefits in each of these categories. So what are some of the obstacles? Here we can see how the miles of transmission that have been added in recent years has declined, the high capacity transmission. We've been more focused on the smaller pieces, which are necessary, but it's also helpful to look at where high capacity transmission can help address some of the local issues on a more cost-effective basis. So planning has been a big focus. That's something that FERC has been looking at, but it's not something that has to be done strictly in compliance with FERC regulations. There's a lot that can be done within the regions. Yesterday, I was in Detroit talking with Organization of MISO States and the Midwestern Governors Association, and it once again gave rise to the saying, the Midwest does it best. They do plan because they work together very well. Permitting, there are significant challenges, especially around federal permitting. And to build a high capacity long line almost necessarily involves some sort of federal permitting process. The Harvard review shows that there were only of more than 30 transmission lines initiated after EPAC 2005, they take an average of more than 10 years to complete. And we've all heard about the lines, the Gateway projects, Transwest Express, SunZia, where they're predominantly on federal lands in the West. They've each taken more than 17 years of federal permitting. So that is extreme. And then paying, especially where there's a multi-jurisdictional challenges around cost allocation, whether it's within a RTO region, across multiple states, across multiple utility footprints. There's just a lot of challenges to trying to figure out who caused what and how we're going to pay for these very large investments. Although to be fair, they are amortized over a significant period of time, and they do have wide-ranging impacts with wide-ranging benefits. And so, so there is an opportunity to spread these costs widely, which significantly reduces the impact on each individual bill. ASEG has been advocating for FERC action to take a look at cost allocation according to benefits. and to have Congress take another look at the tax credit that ended up on the cutting room floor after the Inflation Reduction Act. In terms of cost allocation being commensurate with benefits, that ties back to a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals case for about a dozen years ago. And it's interesting when we think about benefits, there is research going back, a Federal Power Commission engineer from 1934 listed out something like 9 benefits, economic benefits of transmission. So we've known about these for a long time. There's both the reliability and economic benefits, as I discussed on the last slide. So even if we just focus on those, there are significant pluses to planning on a regional basis. All right, so what makes a well-planned grid? They're kind of these three factors. So a long-term look ahead, something like a 20-year forecast, something that's frequently done in integrated resource planning. Scenario planning, looking at all of the changes coming up. So we've all heard about changes in the resource mix, whatever the driver, right? So some of it comes from state RPSs, renewable portfolio standards. Some of it comes from customers, not just the Googles and the Metas of the world, but also the Johnson & Johnson and McDonald's and Walmarts and others. Also, we have utilities. For instance, Idaho Power, or the state of Idaho doesn't have a portfolio standard. However, Idaho Power does have a clean goal standard, just because a clean energy goal, because it helps de-risk the business. We're also seeing a lot of changes in load, electric vehicles, electrifying buildings, heating, artificial intelligence and data farms, onshoring manufacturing. So there are a lot of different drivers. I think we're hoping for efficiencies in load, and we've certainly seen that in the past. But we've been coasting for a while on the headroom that was available after some build in like around 2010, 2011, and the huge dip in load after 2008. So we've been coasting, but now we're starting to see it catch up with us, and we need to build to keep up with it. Certainly, we've seen changes in extreme weather, in terms of heat domes and polar vortexes and all kinds of weather. I thought it was just, partly sunny or partly rainy. But, we've seen much more dramatic impacts for extreme weather. Plan for all benefits. Like I said, the economic benefits have been identified long ago. Senator Manchin's second bill was very specific in outlining economic and reliability benefits, and also the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that came out of FERC. Things like, pooling resources, not having to build as much generation or provide as much fuel for generation in your footprint if you can share during events of extreme weather with neighbors. And then the last piece focuses on cost allocation. There's certainly a strong role for states to be involved, but ultimately these lines do have a regional impact, and they are in the national interest. If we think about the highway system, being able to get goods from one part of the country to another, it's similar with being able to provide geographic diversity, not just of resources, but also of conditions. Weather conditions, storms, can impact a locality, but you can have access to generation from an area that is not as adversely impacted, and that helps. But to do that, we need to think about transmission as a bit of an insurance policy against that, and have some sort of either dispute resolution or backstop cost allocation for this transmission that has federal-wide national benefits. Okay, so with that, let's dive into the report card. I just want to start, as was noted, I was with Chairman Wellinghoff during Order 1000. There were a lot of exciting innovations there, a lot of things that were tried and were expected to be built on or changed. I feel like I'm constantly in defense mode, noting that this was supposed to be iterative. This was supposed to be looked at and examined, rather than it kind of got stuck in place. Part of it due to leadership or politics or, a number of different reasons. But just as we've seen RTOs and markets look at market mechanisms have changed and evolved over time, we really haven't done that much with transmission planning rules. And so we're very excited about FERC thinking about updating the rules, but there's certainly a lot of opportunities within regions to look at innovations, and some have been undertaken and have led to tremendous success. So we took a look at the regions and how they're planning and how it's going, not just as a compliance box checking exercise, but how things are getting planned and built, actually getting steel in the ground. There's some really great innovations out there, but looking at the overall picture, there's a long ways to go. I'll admit there's some subjectivity here, some data is missing, especially outside organized markets. It can be tough to have visibility and transparency. But there was a large review committee. We had folks from every region, every business model, NGOs, think tanks, and others. We really did try to cast a wide net. So we stand by these grades and we look forward to updating them over time. Broadly, here are the, sorry. Got to go back real quick. All right. So looking at the map, I'll admit single state planners have a bit of an easier time of it. But also note, MISO, I'll call them out repeatedly. MISO is unique in that, Ruby Red and Royal Blue states were able to work together and are still doing so, as I saw earlier this week, in order to make progress in planning. There's some promising new developments. I know PJM is currently undertaking a planning process. The Midwest is looking at it. Western Power Pool recently convened their Western Transmission Expansion Coalition. So there are a lot of great opportunities out there. So we look forward to updating this every 2 years. Okay. So methodology, 2/3 we looked at planning methods and 1/3 we looked at impacts. So planning is the subject of the pending FERC notice of proposed rulemaking, but changes can be made in absence of that final rule. This is what sets us up for the future. And we talked about the 3 elements that are important for a strong final rule and that are really key to planning going forward. The impacts, congestion, capacity available for new resources. So that's a way of saying not just the length of the interconnection queue isn't really a very good metric, because some of the entities that could be in the planning queue may expect to drop out. We've certainly heard that complaint. And so instead of looking at the size or the length of the interconnection queue, we instead looked at the capacity available for new resources, because that is what helps determine the cost of upgrades that are required for new resources to come onto the system, and to what extent transmission congestion is essentially a barrier to new resources coming onto the system. So it's another way of sort of measuring the ability for interconnection without getting into that term, which has kind of a loaded meaning. And then transmission miles planned and built. There are some creative ways of doing this, and really excited to see some of the opportunities out there. Frankly, there's some workarounds, leftover benefits from earlier plans. So we see some residual, but as we noted, that's going to run out. So we need to take a fresh look at some of these areas. All right, so planning. These are all the different factors that went into planning. Most notably, it should be done on a proactive basis, not only done in response to interconnection requests. Circumstances are changing, as noted, new load through electrification of a whole lot of things. Also new demands on the system with electric onshoring. I spoke recently with someone who has a business model of identifying tracts of land where he can make sure there is a sufficient amount of energy capacity so that new manufacturing can locate there. Because I've also heard, on the other hand, folks who have not been able to get sufficient energy capacity where they want to build and where they want to develop new products. And so they're being limited in their economic opportunity. So planning for the new load is important, because if we don't plan effectively, consumers are at risk. The Midwest does a good job of regional planning. at least MISO Classic in particular. I know they're working also with MISO South. Let me forward. There were a number of different grades. California does a good job of considering all of the different values together, economic, reliability, and they have strong environmental goals. So they do that multi-value planning rather than in kind of onesies and twosies. That's where it really gets more expensive when we don't look at things in a comprehensive way. California has also been identifying interregional lines that can help provide diversity for some of their generation within California, right? Since they're a single state with that big duck curve that we've all seen so many times. And so they are providing funding for Transwest Express and some other lines so they can bring in, for instance, wind from Wyoming to balance their portfolio. So here we can see, the planes. So that's SPP. They're doing a good job with JTIQ, but JTIQ again is planned to specifically bring on new resources. It's an affected system study. It doesn't address, for instance, gaps in reliability planning, right? So where there were storms with Winter Storm Uri that led to a lot of transfers between SPP and MISO, looking at those transfers, for instance, because that could identify where additional transmission would be helpful. So planning for the wide range of needs, economic reliability, other drivers, public policy drivers, all of those pieces are helpful. But at least they're planning for new resources. Certainly, other regions could also do better. Planned and built. This is the steel in the ground metric, evaluating actual plans and actual building. So again, the Midwest ISO has done a great job. They have their 4 tranches, as well as JTIQ helping move things forward. New York has been doing a good job. They have at least 8 lines coming online in the near future through a wide range of processes. So for instance, they have 2 AC lines coming on through their public policy project. My understanding is there are also 4 NYPA lines and the Champlain, Hudson, and Empire State Connector. So some merchant transmission as well. There've been a lot of success stories with merchant transmission. There's certainly a role for that. That can be a helpful way to knock out some needs that would be difficult to plan and finance otherwise, because they don't kind of go through the normal utility footprint, the way we're used to thinking through things. But on the other hand, they do a good job of kind of matching up high gen opportunities with high load opportunities. And so we also need to think about how to make sure that the grid serves everyone, right? So again, thinking about the highway system, making sure that we're able to serve our neighbors in rural areas, that truly no one's left behind. Rural electrification was one of the great advancements of the 20th century, and we need to make sure that sufficient energy for precision agriculture, for folks living in all corners of the country, make sure that their electric needs are met. In the Pacific Northwest, they've done a good job with Xcel is building the Public Service Colorado Pathway project in Colorado. PacifiCorp has Gateway and NV Energy has Green Link. Gateway is like 1,300 miles of 500 kV, and Greenlink is another 600 miles of 500 kV transmission. So regionally significant transmission, but because it's so hard to build regionally, they're building it within their own utility footprint, which means that the customers in those regions are really shouldering the lion's share of those costs, even though there's broader benefit. For instance, instead of just bringing power down from Washington, Oregon, California, there's opportunity now, once all these different pieces are built, to link it through the Rocky Mountains. So what is getting built? The most recent years compared to, this is how it was compared. The most recent years, so the 2019 to 2021 was compared to 2012 to 2017. So that's how that metric was determined. Basically, we need to double the current pace of construction in order to meet our clean energy goals going forward. Okay, so now we're getting into capacity available. Again, this is not focused on the size of the queue, but how quickly are viable projects getting interconnected? What's the queue completion rate? So there's a bit of a curve, I'll be honest. How's one region doing relative to other regions? Because frankly, nobody's doing great. And what is the cost of interconnection? Again, where transmission is well planned, costs are lower because there's adequate capacity for transmission resource. There's adequate capacity for interconnected resources. So if we think about it, the MISO MVP about a dozen years ago built in a lot of headroom on the system so that as new resources came on, they were focused more on, is their tie line cost effective, really focused on their particular resource rather than do they have to pay for a whole new lane on the highway? Do they have to upgrade a whole new transmission line that everybody else is then going to come on to behind? And it's really hard then to allocate those costs to a first mover because they're overly burdensome and cause folks to drop out, and then you have to restudy. We all know the horror stories. So again, this is capacity for new resources, but this is a little misleading. I kind of want to put this out here. So for instance, Texas has a lot of capacity for new resources. They interconnect new resources, but then when it's congested, they get curtailed. The new resources get curtailed. So you can get on the system really well, but you might not be able to flow. So again, there are a lot of challenges out there. And this is about interconnecting new resources. All right, so methodology for congestion. Congestion is a lagging indicator of planning and building. So odds are where there's congestion, there's going to be curtailment. So talking about the Texas challenges, we don't have a lot of data outside organized markets. So this is more a projection based on national trends. But wanted to kind of highlight some of the challenges around congestion. So this is something we need to plan for. So this is the kind of the overall scores. Want to point out that there are a lot that state regulators can do and utilities can do. And we've seen, for instance, in the Midwest, we've seen Western Power Pool is currently talking through these issues. What can folks on the ground do for themselves? All stakeholders have a role to play, and regulators do as well, to explore how to best build and plan regional and interregional transmission. There are opportunities for joint ventures, multi-state convenings, and planning around shared needs and benefits. There are a lot of opportunities to get creative. We have some best practices and regions that can implement them outside of FERC-approved processes. There's Aubrey, who gave me my best line about throw the rule book out the window and plan for what you need. Sorry, Aubrey, I have to call you out on that one. So just to kind of remind us why we're here, want to point out this 1954 speech that was given to governors focused on why we need to build out a highway system. Note that America has a transportation system which is best in the world. See how much of this resonates when we think about the grid. Best in the world, but far from the best that America can do for itself. Designed largely for local movement at low speeds, it has been adjusted, it is true, at intervals to address congestion, transcontinental movement, and increased horsepower, but it has never been completely overhauled or planned to satisfy the needs 10 years ahead. And to just point out, when the highway system was built in the early 1950s, it was planned with this incredibly far-ranging perspective. 20 years in the future, they were going to build out to 1974. So their goal at the time was a comprehensive highway program in 10 years. Honestly, I think that's something we can do with transmission today. We can plan in 2, permit in 5, and build in 3. And Americans for Clean Energy Grid has ideas on how to do all of those, which we'd be happy to discuss maybe at the next workshop. With that, I want to leave us with a video. I'll be honest, I kind of draw on other parts of my life. My understanding is there is a story similar to this in many cultures throughout the world, the idea that there are enough resources for everyone if we can figure out the best way to share them. out you need more resources, sharing it with good links, make sure there's enough for everyone. All right. So that's what I have on the report card, and I'm happy to answer questions or whatever whatever fits Michael's agenda. How about that?
Thank you, Christina. If you have just a clarifying question or something you would like to add, we do have just a few minutes in this block. If you want to just type those into the chat or into the Q&A. Christina, I guess I'll throw just one out at you. You know, especially in those areas where we don't have RTOs or ITOs in place already, um, you know, multi-state companies that operate across multiple regions may have their own transmission planning systems that aren't kind of picked up in the way the rubric is structured. And how do you incorporate that, or what are your thoughts about how those might work differently, and how that plays out in the rubric that you guys created?
No, that's a good point. And we see that in in FERC speak, the Derby Dragons regions, right? So it's the southeast and the west, right? And so there often you have large utilities that are planning for their own customers' needs. And in full disclosure, I used to work for the parent company of one of those utilities in the west, the parent company of PacifiCorp and NV Energy. And so I can speak to the strengths, but also the challenges of they build out for their customers' needs. And also that's really expensive to build on the backs of your customers alone. And so there are benefits if you have a system that's large enough. And that is really kind of one of the unique factors about the United States and even about these regions, that they are so incredibly large, that you can have incredible diversity of resources within your own footprint. But it is important to continue to kind of ground truth that with looking at what are the opportunities to access generation outside, and even honestly from your own profit motive, market benefit, to be able to sell your resources when you have a surplus, to be able to sell outside your market. So there really are benefits to being able to trade. Certainly you want to have a strong unit. And, for instance, balancing area authorities are required by NERC to have their own resources, right? Their own reserves. And so it's important to plan within, and there's also significant benefit to look at planning with your neighbors.
Okay, thank you.
That might have been captured less well than others, though, I will admit.
Well, thank you for that. We don't have any questions popping up in the chat, so I'm going to, we don't have the opportunity to kind of give you the round of applause that we would if we were all in person, but I want to thank you for taking your time today and sharing with us and kind of launching our conversation and giving us a starting point anyway for what's to come. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing where the conversation goes.
Thank you.
So our next panel, our next session is a panel. We decided that to follow this conversation, we should put this, have some discussion at the industry level and talk about from the different industry sector perspectives, what some of these challenges are and how we might move forward from their perspectives. And then we'll have a follow-on panel of commissioners, some of whom were involved in the NARUC and FERC Joint Task Force, to kind of share their perspectives on what some of these issues are that we need to deal with to move forward. So I want to go ahead and move on to our next panel. I think I've seen everybody log in. So you could go ahead and turn on your cameras, and I would like to introduce our moderator for this panel, and he will have the pleasure of introducing the rest of the crew. So our moderator for this session is Lanny Nickel. Lanny is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Southwest Power Pool, a FERC-approved regional transmission organization. He leads engineering, operations, markets, and information technology teams, and is responsible for overseeing reliable operation of the bulk electric power system, administration of wholesale energy markets, development of transmission expansion plans, and administration of resource adequacy policies within the SPP region. Mr. Nickel has also served as Vice President of Engineering, Vice President of Operations, and in various management and engineering roles since joining SPP in 1997. So Lanny, thank you for being with us today and agreeing to moderate this group. And I will turn it over to you. It looks like, let's see, Simon's here, David's here. Aubrey, I know you are on. If you could turn on your camera. And
it's blocked, Michael. It's blocked.
Oh, let me fix that for you. Okay. I will fix that for both of you and get you online here. So Aubrey, or ask to start video for Aubrey, and for Carrie. Doing all of this in this setting is a little bit different for all of us. So there we go. Carrie, you should be good. And we have about an hour for your conversation and look forward to hearing it.
Michael, looks like we have David with us as well, David Mendham, but I don't see his camera on.
Yeah, I have camera problems too.
Let me make sure that that's now it looks like it's a camera problem on your end. Your video stream is just black.
Okay, I'll log into my phone while we're doing introductions and be right back.
Okay.
All right. Well, Michael, if you're ready, I will go ahead and begin.
The floor is yours.
All righty. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Lanny Nickel, Chief Operating Officer for Southwest Power Pool. And as Michael explained my history with Southwest Power Pool, I've been there a long time, but I've had the pleasure of being able to oversee SPP's transmission planning efforts for several years. And so I understand the importance and the criticality of planning the grid in the right way and in the best way for consumers and ratepayers across our footprint and, of course, across America. So I'm very happy to be part of this panel and being able to moderate it, be involved in the dialogue that I know is going to be occurring throughout the workshop. You know, I've always viewed transmission as a value-added enabler for the electric industry. It's not the part of the industry that's the most expensive. You know, distribution and generation segments, when you look at the average consumer bill, represents together as much as 85 to 90% of the bill, and transmission only about 10 to 15%. But as Christina has actually already pointed out, it enables more reliable delivery of lower cost generation to load. It enables resilience so that power can continue to be delivered or quickly return to service during extreme events. And it will need to be relied upon much more than it's been to date to enable a reliable transition to clean energy technologies. In fact, a buzz phrase has developed. I don't know who coined it first, so I can't give proper credit, but I've heard several people use this phrase recently, and it's something along the lines of there can be no transition without transmission. So I'm sure many of our panelists who are with me for this session right now share the same perspective on the tremendous value that transmission has provided to our industry and our consumers and will continue to provide in the future. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce them. I'm very pleased to have with me today Aubrey Johnson, Vice President of System Planning and Competitive Transmission for MISO, David Mendham, Director of Regulatory and Market Affairs for EDP Renewables, Carrie Powell, Vice President of Transmission and Fuels Strategy for Duke Energy, Barbara Tyron, Director of External Relations at the National Hydropower Association, and she also serves as advisor for the Macro Grid Initiative at the American Council on Renewable Energy, otherwise known as ACOR. And then finally, Simon Whitlock, Vice President of ITC Holdings and President of ITC Michigan. So with that, let me just kind of open by asking each of you to say a few words about your roles, and particularly how your roles either directly impact or are impacted by transmission development. And I'm just going to kind of go across the screen as I see you. Barbara, let's begin with you.
Good. Thank you very much, Lonnie. Appreciate it. And thank you to FRI for the chance to be here and participate in this stimulating discussion, and for Christina's opening remarks. Very well delivered as always. So yes, there is, of course, a lot of value to transmission. That was brought out in our opening statements. And as you just said, Lonnie, as well, it improves system reliability and performance and the flexibility of the system. It reduces cost to consumers because we can share resources across larger geographic footprints. With increasing evidence of extreme weather, it enables us to, as I like to say, when we're talking about anecdotes, it makes the grid bigger than the weather, which means that it can help to mitigate the impact of those extreme weather events, which is so important, not only from the standpoint of alleviating financial loss, but also human suffering that is concurrent with that. And as I look at it from the standpoint of our using our hydro resources, why they can provide terrific backup to other renewable energy resources, but usually require transmission in order to be deployed and executed in a manner where they can achieve the greatest good. So there's innumerable benefits. And I know this panel will look through all of that very carefully, as well as some of the challenges that lie ahead. Thanks for the opportunity to start.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Simon, so again, for you, if you could just kind of talk about your current role at ITC Michigan and how that role impacts transmission or is impacted by it. And then, as Barbara did, go ahead and just tell us more about how you view the value of transmission and how is it that your consumers receive that value?
Sure. Thanks, Lanny, and thanks to FRI for the opportunity. So yeah, my current role at President of ITC Michigan, responsible for basically all things to do with our business here in Michigan. We're a transmission only company. That's all we do. So that's a great panel discussion for me. And I think as I think about it, it's what are we doing to ensure we have reliability today for our customers? And then what are we doing to make sure that we can maintain that reliability into the future? So dealing with all the stuff that's coming at us from, as Barbara mentioned, some of them, I think even though I have the Michigan perspective, though, clearly Michigan is just part of a larger grid, and definitely pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the planning sphere. And as ITC is in multiple RTOs, we're in 7 states, soon to be 8. MISO, SPP, PJM, we're really watching what's going on and participating in all of the planning work that's going on, because we recognize that, especially looking into the future, we're going to have a robust grid. We're going to be even more reliant on our neighbors. The days of just worrying about what's happening in your own backyard, I think those are long gone, as we've seen. So I think our perspective is, certainly take care of our knitting, but make sure that we have an eye to the future and have connections beyond just the state that we're in. So, from the value of transmission, I think I was actually going to use that phrase, there is no transition without transmission. I just heard it today for the first time. And, needing a grid that's bigger than the weather, those two things kind of sum it up for us, with the EVs coming at us, with the transition to more and more renewables, weather challenges, those things all sort of speak to needing a more robust grid. And I think the challenge is the time is of the essence. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Simon. All right, David, Mr. Mendham, I'm going to go to you next and just kind of repeat the same question and answer that I've already asked the others. Go ahead, David.
Great. Thanks, Lanny. Apologize for the video quality. If for some reason I can't get my camera to work on my computer, so I'm on my phone, but hopefully we'll deal with the logistical issues. Hi, David Mindham, Associate Vice President of Regulatory and Market Development for EDP Renewables, which is a large renewable developer kind of all across the board, wind, solar, storage. We have a hydrogen business. We have joint ventures on offshore wind, large multinational corporation. I think in the US, we're about to cross 10 gigawatts of operational resources. And I think globally, we're the fourth largest renewable energy producer. So when I think about transmission, well, I often get pulled into my CEO's office, and she always asks, what is the biggest barrier to meeting our capital spend goals in North America? And I always respond, it's transmission. Transmission is really the enabling technology that allows us as a company to invest capital in the US and to meet, sort of our renewable deployment goals. And it's not just us. I think this story repeats itself across the board. You talk about industrial customers, or there's a push in the US right now to source more industrial goods domestically. You can't build those factories and you can't employ those people without transmission enabling the connection of those resources. Same for data centers, or as we try to move to more automation and AI-centric business models, we need the data centers to support that, and transmission enables all of that technology. I think as a value statement, we often get bogged down in sort of the value of transmission is just the cost of energy, and I don't think that's true. I think the real value of transmission is it's an economic enablement of new technologies across North America. And I'll just add the point, like right now, a lot of the value of transmission is seen to those places or regions that don't have enough. They have the inability to attract new loads, have the inability to attract new resources in the energy transition. And the real value of transmission is understood once it stops the enablement of economic development. So appreciate the chance to give my opening thoughts, Lanny, and I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you, David. And Carrie, I'm going to go to you next. Kind of just describe your role and how it impacts transmission, and what do you believe the value is?
Well, thanks, Lanny, and thanks for allowing me to participate, and Michael for coordinating this. So my current role is Vice President of Transmission Fuels Strategy and Planning, if you'll say that. But it really, about 3 years ago, when Duke was getting heavy into our clean energy transition, we'd already eliminated a lot of coal. We were starting that transition. We created this separate function to really focus long-term on what we needed transmission-wise and fuel-wise to make this transition. If you follow North Carolina at all, there is a law out that says net zero by 2050 and 70% reduction by 2030, which we're well on the way to achieve. For me, transmission is really that intricate hub that makes the interconnected bulk power system function. We need an effective, well-designed transmission system to enable our reliable and what I'd say is nearly continuous electric service that customers enjoy today. But more importantly, for this discussion, it provides a level of flexibility to connect both our large generation stations centralized and our distributed renewable and other resources. And transmission, as we've seen, is part of the key first step to really unleash that. So we'll have some questions later and we'll be able to talk through that. And I'll share some of the work we've done recently that I think has made a difference in our transition. So thanks for letting me be a part of this, and look forward to questions and other comments.
You bet. Aubrey, I've saved you for last, and if you want to think of it as saving the best for last, feel free to do so. But the reason I saved you for last is because you're the only one of the panelists that represents an RTO. And so as your neighbor to the west, I'm going to ask you to talk about, in your role for being responsible for transmission planning at MISO, the value that you believe is provided as a result of your processes specifically, and feel free to elaborate on that as much as you'd like, but even more generally, what's the value of an RTO and the planning process that they enable?
So thanks, Lanny. Thanks for being with you again. This is probably our third or fourth time doing this together. So we'll have some fun today and appreciate the opportunity to join this FRI panel discussion. As Lanny mentioned, I am the Vice President of System and Resource Planning for MISO. So in this role, I have responsibility for all aspects of transmission planning. So that's reliability planning, interregional planning, economic and policy planning. I also have the responsibility for resource adequacy, resource planning, our interconnection queue, if you will, modeling, and competitive transmission. So we have a few things to spend our time with around here today. In our role, and I think the role of MISO, I think about us in many ways as, obviously, all RTOs operate electricity markets, right? So we enable, in the MISO space, we operate and enable a $40 billion electricity market. And a key component of that is the actual transmission system. And I think everybody else has kind of hit on the key component that in reality, transmission is an enabler. It allows us to pass energy from where it's generated to the actual load where it's needed, and to do that reliably, efficiently, and ultimately sustainably. And so I think that one of the things that we're doing when you think about the 7 domestic RTOs, if you will, is really creating a space for all of our members to come and aggregate, pool their resources, think about how you do things to reduce your planning reserve margin requirements, which creates value for all of the states and entities and our end use customers. We create a market for the effective usage of the transmission system and really the expansion of that transmission system by looking at and aggregating our different member plans and ultimately trying to make sure that those plans align and work well together. I think across the board, we create the ability for and have the processes that allow us to have an interregional focus. And I think, again, one of the things that we can think about is how, as you know, we've had several references to winter storms and extreme events, and going back to, I believe, Winter Storm Uri, where we had and coordinated the flow of over 13,000 gigawatts, 13 gigawatts of electricity from PJM through MISO, and to at different points in time, 6 to 7 gigawatts into SPP. And so those operational aspects, as well as the long-term planning aspects, I think create a more robust electric generation system for us within the Eastern Interconnect and the United States of America. And then again, I think about it this way, as we look at this really, I think, aggressive energy transition is going on. I think in particular, the RTOs have the opportunity, working with our members, to address some of the really challenging problems that exist as we make this transition. And so in that regard, I believe and view us as a key enabler for our members to help achieve the goals that they have in the states that we live and operate on, and to do that in a way that will be reliable, efficient, and ultimately sustainable.
Aubrey, I appreciate you saying all of that. Very well said. We've talked a lot about the transition already. And it is happening, right? There is an energy transition that's going on. It's happening. Resource mix is evolving and changing. We haven't talked yet a lot about load growth. And I've seen and heard, at least anecdotally, that load growth is happening at a rate that it's been a while since we've seen, this kind of growth. Even in SPP, we saw 10% increase in our summer peak load over the last 2 years. It's 10% higher now than it was 2 years ago. And I've heard even greater numbers across America. And so that's, while we're talking about the transition to renewable resources, at the same time, we're seeing and expecting dramatic increases in load. It's pretty scary. And so I just think that just adds to the need for transmission going forward. And I would also I'm a numbers guy. Sorry, I want to provide you just some numbers to consider. We've seen tremendous value in our footprint that's been provided by the transmission that's already been installed. And, we've had about $12 billion worth of transmission that's been directed for construction since becoming an RTO. our studies have shown, and I think, Aubrey, I know you all have done similar studies as well. Am I still with you all?
Yes.
Okay, for some reason, it went away. Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
You're doing a great job too.
Well, I appreciate that. I thought maybe I had lost internet connectivity, but anyway, just talking about the value that our studies have shown, we've seen a range of anywhere between $3.50 to $5.25 for every dollar invested. This is based on transmission that's already been placed into service. For every dollar invested, somewhere between $3.50 to a little over $5 of value. Aubrey, you've already talked about the resilience benefits. During Winter Storm Uri, we had about 14% of our demand that was being imported across the strong interconnections we had with our neighbors. And to put that in perspective, at most, ERCOT could have imported about 1.5% of their demand. So without that capability, our experience would have been much, much worse. And then we talked about, renewables. I mean, right now, we have about 33,000 megawatts of nameplate wind capacity, and it's our #1 energy producer. That would not have happened. The ability to add that kind of renewable power would not have happened without the transmission. We've seen as much as 90% of our load served by renewables. That's the highest renewable penetration any region has seen to date. And we routinely see over about 70% of our load served by renewables on a fairly routine basis. So again, just want to give you some numbers just to think about, because I think that's a tremendous testament to the value that transmission can and has already provided. And I'll let you guys, any of you want to just follow up based on some of the numbers that I've already shared. Aubrey, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a couple quick things for you, Lanny. And I think one of the things that we're having a lot of discussion around is this whole notion of load growth. And what we're seeing is a little bit different term. Our members often aren't ready to commit to full discussions around load growth, thinking about those things as being sustained. But what we're seeing is a lot of load additions. And those load additions are actually happening at a fairly rapid and consistent level. And so they may not be ready to say load growth, but it's managed right around the corner. And we've seen that with our latest transmission expansion plan. In just a few weeks, our board of directors will approve a roughly $9 billion transmission expansion plan. This will be our largest MTEP cycle that did not include an MVP or LRTP portfolio. We've got about $4 billion of that in our South region that's really being driven by these spot load additions. And that's not just the only place. I mean, we can point to things we're seeing in Indiana. Simon can talk about some of the battery plants and stuff that are coming in Michigan that are going to place demands there. We're seeing demands really coming in Iowa. And so it's there. And even outside of our region, you could have seen in the trade press earlier where PJM's annual expansion plan represents a significant investment to address the growth that they're seeing in the Northern Virginia area. And so I think you're spot on in that regard, in the sense of those things have to happen. And I'll put one other point there too, is that we've had members that basically talk about as we're seeing more onshore domestic production, and recognizing that the United States of America is actually a world leader, if you will, now in energy production. We are the largest producer of natural gas, and we have cheap natural gas in that regard. But what's also happening is, as people from European and other countries look to come to the US, they also want to have access to renewable energy to fuel their growth. And so when you think about that, that's also an enabler that transmission will allow to happen. Because again, a plant may be located in Michigan, and they want to have a significant portion of their power to come from renewable energy. That has to be in the system to be able to supply that. So I think as we think about these spot load additions, also recognizing that they're creating opportunities, they're also introducing a desire to have access to renewable energy, and they're providing an undercurrent of both economic as well as sustained load growth.
So I
Where,
think what Aubrey,
if I could just, oh, go ahead, Carrie.
yeah, I was just gonna say, I think what Aubrey is really touching on is really this 3-point attack on transmission, if you will. So not only are we seeing load growth, and we are seeing similar load growth, and I love the discussion about, point load, like we are getting lots of data centers and battery manufacturers and other types of large industrial load come into all of our locations. So you've got to use transmission for that. We are seeing the transition that we're putting in place, right, to move off of coal to more cleaner energy sources. That's creating transmission need. And then just the incremental additional generation. So that's really the third point. It's not replacing generation, it's replacing generation and adding generation to meet that load. All of that affects transmission and requires us to be very deliberate in how we're planning through this. And I think to Christina's point from before, plan much more longer term, because it's not going to be 1 year at a time. It's going to be multi-year.
We're definitely going to have to figure out a way to get transmission built faster. There's no doubt about it. Simon, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to add on in terms of this economic development in Michigan and Iowa, for that matter. We're seeing record number of projects that are pursuing, mega site locations. This is more activity than I've ever seen in 20 years at ITC, and probably going back decades before that. And each of these projects is larger than any single load that we may currently have on our system. So we have many of them, and they're all very, very large relative to the existing system, and they want to be on as soon as possible. So they want, as you said, they want to be on ASAP. They want to know what the reliability profile is. They want to know where the electricity is coming from, that it's renewable. And so we've never seen this type of activity. And I think the impact that's going to have on the system is tremendous. So definitely agree that that's coming right at us. And we're seeing it from large manufacturing for EVs, batteries, etc., data centers. Those seem to be the main sources here in Michigan. And then I think in Iowa, it tends to be clean fuels and data centers and other things, a little bit different, but still huge loads nonetheless.
Well, it's
Also to
certainly.
underscore sorry, Lonnie.
No, go
To
ahead.
underscore the importance of transmission, it's very significant that not only is FRI sponsoring a transmission workshop right now, but simultaneously DOE is also hosting a webinar on their transmission needs study. And part of the conclusions of that study are that we need more regional transmission capacity of 20 to 128% by 2035, and 25 to 412% more interregional transmission by 2035. So again, that's also underscoring the very importance of this. We know statistically that 56% of our solar potential and 88% of our wind potential is located in the 15 states between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. But the only way to be able to tap into those resources and reach the load centers that everybody has identified on the East and West Coast in particular, we will need more transmission and more cost-effective transmission at that.
Well, I tell you, it's certainly a very exciting time to be part of the industry. And by exciting, I'm talking about the kind of exciting that causes me to lay in bed at night with my eyes wide open. Because I'm just not sure how we're going to get through all of this and what are the right solutions. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. I'll let you all tell me how I can calm down and get some sleep at night with your ideas for improvements. But before we go there, we've all experienced clearly different levels of success and or satisfaction with the transmission development that's been occurring. And I know all of you on this panel and perhaps some of you that are observing believe that not enough has been built and that there's going to need to be more in the future. I guess I'd like to hear from those of you who feel this way, who feel like we haven't done enough and that more is needed. What do you believe are the factors that have prevented the development of the transmission system we need?
Well, Lonnie, I actually like to quote you. I heard you delivering a presentation a few years ago where you talked about the Eastern and Western interconnection as two Olympic-sized swimming pools that are currently connected by a garden hose. And I've used that anecdote repeatedly, including in a presentation earlier today, because
You're
I think
welcome.
that's such a vivid image. So thank you so much for providing that, because I think everybody in an audience can understand graphically what that means. But having said that, we've identified, I think, across the industry, 3 Ps that are preventing and creating barriers to transmission, and that's planning, permitting, and paying. And I would suggest that of all those, probably the most progress needs to occur around how to pay for the system, how to allocate the costs. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, but there's still a long way to go to achieve consensus.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Other thoughts?
I agree with Barbara in terms of the 3 Ps. I may disagree a little bit. I think on the planning side is probably where we've had the hardest time, because we usually can deal with who pays for it, and we usually can figure out how to site these projects. But from our vantage point, I think there was a chart earlier from the report that showed the number of miles of 345 kV and above transmission that have been built per year, I think. And, we saw that pretty steep decline. And we had in MISO, we had a pretty long break from the MVP portfolio to the LRTP tranche 1. It was about 10 years. And that, I think, is in large part due to just difficulty in planning that type of interregional transmission. Transmission owners have been able to plan sort of local projects and get those done, but that broader transmission planning just was not happening for multiple reasons. One of which is costs. I think there's some fatigue out there, getting through that first MVP portfolio was a pretty big deal. And there was other transmission being built across the country. But I think the other layer that came along was, good old Order 1000, which we heard earlier was supposed to be an iterative thing, but it was sort of stuck as it was initially drafted. And I think, honestly, that really put a wet blanket over the planning process, and specifically the competitive transmission piece really hampered the collaboration among the transmission owners that's really needed when you're talking about a system that's multiple parties, grid ownership, hundreds of transmission owners that have to collaborate and come together in concert with the RTOs. That really, I think, ground things to a halt for the industry, and I think was in large part contributing to why things have slowed down. I think we've seen a lot of states, including Michigan, implement ROFR laws, which I think has really helped to free things up. And I think we've seen it. If you superimpose the tranche 2 projects over the map of the states that have implemented ROFR legislation, I think there's no coincidence there. And I think part of the reason is, in my opinion, time is of the essence. We don't really have time to muck around with this stuff anymore. When you think about the wave of whether it's the load additions, whether it's the renewables, whether it's EVs, whether it's renewable portfolio standards, the timeframes sort of all converge in the mid 2030s timeframe. And when you think about how long it takes to build something, from a transmission perspective, it's 8 to 10 years. Like, if we don't start today, we're not going to get to where we need to in the early to mid 2030s. So anyway, I think it's a multitude of things, but to me, it's more on the planning side that we've been hung up. I think we can get through the other 2 pieces when we need to.
Okay. Thank you, Simon.
All right, I'll jump in too. I work for a renewable developer, and I've been in RTOs across North America, and I coordinate with my colleagues globally on these issues. And I'll tell you, I think the story is largely the same everywhere in the world. Everybody wants to pay for the exact amount of transmission they need to enable their business interests, and we don't want to pay one dime more. And I think even if you look across the stakeholder groups, you can see this. And I think the planning process is a reflection of that dynamic. I think it plays out there. I think if you're in the stakeholder process, you see it everywhere. And from the IPP perspective, it's a hyper independent power producer. It's a hyper competitive environment. We are competing competing on every single dime that goes into our projects on cost. Transmission's a cost, so we need to compete on lowering those costs as much as we can in the planning process. At the same time, transmission's an enabler. It helps us build our projects, but we're competing. And that's a short-term view on the value of transmission in the planning process. Same thing with industrial customers. I mean, once they're online, their goal is to cut their energy costs, their operational costs as much as they can, and transmission's an operational cost. If they're not online, they want more transmission. If they are, they don't. And you can take a look at it across the board. Regulators, they sometimes are mandated to look solely at costs, which is a barrier. And so if you look down to like transmission dependent utilities, they want to enable their business models and they want to lower those costs as much as they want. And even if you look at vertically integrated utilities that you would think would view transmission as an asset to invest in that has high value, it also enables marginal zero cost resources that have negative impacts on their portfolios and enables competition on markets that weren't traditionally competitive. All of those interests and combined make transmission difficult to plan. And so I do want to give a quick shout out to Lanny and SPP if I can. They are trying to tackle this problem in sort of a creative way through a consolidated planning process where you lump everybody's needs into one process. And that kind of solves the problem, or at least we hope it will. We're still working through the details. But from my perspective, that's really the problem, is that all of these business interests are colliding to both try to lower transmission and build transmission at the same time.
All right, thank you, David. Aubrey or Carrie, anything to add?
Yeah, so I'll just say it's a great question and something that we all wrestle with, right? I think we all recognize the benefit of transmission, and you've heard us in violent agreement on that here today. But I think there's it's important for us to recognize that there can be a big difference between want and need, right? I want that large, tasty piece of chocolate cake, but I may not need it, and I may not be able to afford it. So every dollar that we invest in transmission is a dollar that's not invested someplace else. And we've got a lot of state regulators that look at that and want to get the highest value for the customers. And I know that we've talked about investment in transmission, and then that lowers the cost of a generator that comes on, but it's really the same cost. It's just a matter of who pays for it. And the customer is the one that pays for everything. So effective regional planning is certainly important, but we've got to balance that, at least in our territories, against our local planning. Duke is going to add 10 gigawatts of renewable generation and 3 gigawatts of storage in the next decade. And that's just in the Carolinas. And so what we really need now, as we look, of course, our landscape, is local transmission to support that growth. If you consider the size of Duke and the Carolinas, for example, our balancing areas are really in the middle of the pack of RTOs as far as size and complexity. So for us, in many cases, local and regional are somewhat the same. One barrier I see, and we've talked about it a little bit, and I think I'm sure our renewable guys would support it, is this very sequential process of we study an interconnection request, we identify network upgrades, we design and build, and then we interconnect. That has a long timeline across it. So that's a sizable challenge. And that's especially true today when we have, it takes longer to acquire land, more difficult to permit projects, and construction is longer. So I want to highlight two things that we've done at Duke in the Carolinas that have been meaningful actions that I think are making a difference. First, we were an early adopter of the cluster process, and that has helped us move our interconnection agreements along. The second is that we work through our transmission planning process with stakeholders and developed a proactive plan to enable our clean energy transition. So if you look at any of our filings and the hearings at the North Carolina Commission, these are commonly referred to as the red zone expansion plan projects. So what we did is we worked through this process to identify a number of projects that we needed that would open up areas for renewable resources to be added in. So we identified 21 projects, about $800 million. That was incremental on top of our nearly $2 billion a year transmission spend in our area. And we've demonstrated that these are multi-value projects. They promote expansion, reliability, and asset replacement. And I think if you look at our filings, you'll see that return that you mentioned, Lanny, we really saw a little bit over $5 for every dollar of investment when we identified the first slate of those projects. So presently 15 of those projects are underway and will be completed by 2027. 6 more are being introduced this year, and then we have an annual process that will get in front of that. So this effort for us has wide stakeholder support. It has helped lower our costs to developers and for the network transmission. So rather than pancaking additions, we looked at this portfolio and it's made a big difference. Similar approaches can be used for regional consideration. And I think it's not unlike a lot of what MISO is doing for their broader footprint.
Okay, thank you, Gary.
Yeah. Hey, I'll just, Lanny, I have a little bit different challenge than you. So I don't have a problem going to sleep, but I have a problem staying asleep. And so, so I get at it a little bit different way. But I think one of the challenges that I would say is that, everything everybody said, I think has value on some level. They're all part of it, right? And I think it really represents how complicated it is to actually move, a lot of this forward. I can make arguments that fundamentally there are challenges with planning, there's challenges with cost, and ultimately the biggest challenge becomes ultimately how you decide who pays for it. And all of those things have different ways that they show up in the different processes that create its own level of inertia. I think things that we've done, the work we've done with the joint targeted interconnection queue between MISO and SPP, they set us up to help our developers, our interconnection customers, know a known amount of enablement. They're going to know a known amount of what that cost will be. And if you're within that zone, you bring certainty and take out some of the arbitrariness of some of the affected system studies. That's an enabler. That is something that as we work through that, we will have a significant impact. But I can also point to, it took us less than a year to figure out what the portfolio is. And we spent the better part of 18 months trying to work on tariff changes and the appropriate cost allocation that we're both trying to work and pass through in the next couple of months. And so I think that's the case. And I can point to the work we're doing with the long range transmission planning process where, in the better part of 2 years, we got a $10.3 billion portfolio to our members, to our board for approval. And if you think about it, that's really, really fast, if you will. And all along, we worked on cost allocation and some other things along those lines. But I think both of those things are an indicator, and I think David touched on this, and he's referenced the work that you all are trying to do with the coordinated planning process, that in some way we've got to step back and think about the places that we're going. The way that we've traveled in the past is not going to be sufficient to get us there. And ultimately, we've got to work on our members and regulators to understand that the pace of change is so much greater. Our approach has to be different. We have to be more prospective than retrospective. I think about it this way. Some of us are getting closer to retirement than others. But imagine if you had to start your retirement planning today versus when you entered into the industry X amount of years ago. And in many ways, that's how we approach transmission. We only want to pay for it right when it's needed, as opposed to trying to take a longer term view and distributing that cost over a broader view. There's a lot of bright engineers all across this country, and I have every confidence they could figure out how to identify projects that will be used and useful and serve needs both today, tomorrow, and much longer into the future. And I think it's part of having the ability to move beyond a certainty, that we have an expectation and a level of precision on what those costs and benefits are today. And so when I think about those things that are, Barbara kind of alluded to, and you set up this question around, they all play into it. And I think they're all calling upon us to think about things being done differently as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to me that we've spent a lot of time talking about, maybe our shortcomings in the planning process and maybe our shortcomings or challenges with the cost allocation and who pays. I haven't heard anybody talk yet about public perception. I mean, those are a couple of P words. And I know we've had some problems just getting lines constructed. So it's we've been successful figuring out what we need. We've been successful figuring out who pays for it. Now we're having challenges getting lines constructed. And sometimes that's the transmission constructors. Sometimes it's public. I mean, there are a lot of people in this country that do not enjoy seeing big power lines in their backyards. And I think that's, again, it's just another challenge that we have. It's another thing that keeps me awake at night and apparently wakes Aubrey up early in the morning. But, and I'm sure you all are dealing with that.
I'm smiling a little bit because in a previous life, I served in the great state of New Mexico, and we were having a public proceeding where we were talking about a potential transmission line. And there was a stakeholder who basically said that the line affected their view of the horizon. And a comment was made that said, well, sir, that's roughly 10 miles from where you live. You can't see that line. And he says, the fact that I know it's there impacts my view of the horizon. And so, you know, that is something that is tough to deal with. I think Simon made the point of talking about potential rate fatigue. You can have construction fatigue. I think it's real. I think one of the things that we may be underestimating beyond the discussion around transmission is the impact on land usage when we think about the need for solar and wind expansion and how much land that's going to take to go to where we want to go. And so I think, Lanny, you're spot on how we have to think about those things. And one of the things that we're tossing around is, you know, should our owners and should the community be talking more about the overall economic value and economic benefits that come from these investments in both generation and transmission? I don't know what will happen with wind and with solar, but in the good old days where you had a power plant, more often than not, the county that was in, that was the highest taxpayer in that county. And so if you think about some of the tax revenues, you think about some of the economic development from material supply, jobs, et cetera, there's a discussion and a benefit beyond the direct deliverables that come from transmission and generation expansion. And I think there's a story that has to be told that I think help people have a better view about seeing those transmission lines, about seeing the changes in a different usage case for land. And somewhere along the line, we have to find people that want to have those values and really have the direct involvement to see how we can mitigate some of that. Because if we go where we're expecting to go, there's going to be a tremendous amount of development that's occurring in the next 5 to 12 years. And if we're not trying to figure out how to tell a story and tell the value of that, I think we've got some significant inertia coming up against us.
Well, I agree with you. And I tell you that the numbers that have been talked about, whether you believe them or not, are astronomical. The numbers in terms of additional transmission needed to pave the way for a net zero future. And so I think you're absolutely right. You either have to figure out a way to just do it without any fear of public perception, or you figure out how to get the public on your side. I actually had another question I was going to ask, but given the time and given the fact that I think we're already starting to talk about things that we need to do, things that we need to think about in terms of solutions, I'm going to skip that other question that I had. I'll give you a little bit of a teaser. It was about some of the FERC's initiatives and whether or not those have been effective. I actually have already heard, Simon, I don't think you feel like Order 1000 was terribly effective in terms of the competition. So I'm not even going to go there with that question right now, because I really do want to hear from all of you what your thoughts about how do we move forward? How do we make the progress that's going to be needed? What changes are needed to facilitate the kind of transmission development that we're going to need over the next several decades? And it's not just to enable the transition, but it's been able to save lives, right? I mean, because we're having and seeing severe weather events. We have to have enough power. We have to have enough transmission to be able to keep people's homes heated to keep people's homes cooled. And frankly, it saves lives. How do we get there? So I'm going to stop and just, I want to hear from all of you, but what do you think we need to do? What are the solutions that we need to be considering and thinking about?
Maybe I was going to chime in earlier about the public perception, et cetera. And I think that might be a segue, because we just, for one of our LRTP projects that we're working on, we just had to have 22 open house meetings over the last few weeks in conjunction with that project. And, you know, people came out in large numbers, very vocal. We were expecting that. But it really gets to the point that, you know, we're not the only ones that are doing this, right? We have solar developers they're interacting with the public. We have wind, we have other forms of infrastructure. And I guess I firmly believe that you only get so many bites at the apple. And I think we owe it to society to be as efficient as possible in terms of what new infrastructure we're building. So that means that when we build something, we need to be building it for the long haul, and we need to be building things that are going to provide multiple values. One of the other projects, LRTP projects that we have here in the state, it also happens to be a great economic development project because it runs right by one of these mega sites. So, you know, that's a case where it's sort of a multi-value project. Maybe you could think of it that way. And I think we have to think of transmission as broadly as possible and plan as holistically as we can to minimize the number of projects, which will minimize costs, going back to David's point, and it'll minimize the impact on the environment, impact on society. It's harder work. It's a lot easier to, you know, plan for one-off things, but I think we're getting to that point where we have to do more and more kind of batch planning to really end up with fewer lines, you know, on the map, so to speak. That'll save money, provide more benefits, but it takes a little bit more courage because these are probably going to be bigger, more expensive facilities, and that's where we've tended to fall down historically. I was struck by the comparison to the interstate system and sort of having that perspective. Okay, here's where we want to go ultimately. Might be the type of thing I think that we need nationally. Think about it. Ultimately, this is sort of conceptually what we need to accomplish here, and how can we accomplish that? You know, we don't have interstates running, you know, parallel to each other 5 miles apart for a reason, because we stepped back and did some planning way back when. I think that sort of visionary type thinking, as well as batching up the problems to try and solve as many with the same solution as possible is really what we need to do.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. A planning process that produces that kind of an outcome where you have optimal solutions that are right-sized, not for just the needs 5 to 10 years in the future, but well beyond that. That's going to take some courage, and it's going to take a lot of communication and understanding of the consumers, the regulators, the decision makers. They have to understand why that provides value to do it on a much more proactive basis. So thanks, Simon, for that. Other thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Lonnie. And I certainly want to echo what you just said and what Aubrey brought out about public perception, which is so important here. I'm associated with something called the Macro Grid Initiative, which is an educational campaign to communicate the benefits of an enhanced upgraded transmission system that will deliver jobs and economic development, a cleaner environment, and more affordable electricity for consumers. And the reason that educational campaign exists is because the stakeholder community that's getting involved in our electrification efforts is growing and becoming more diverse, which is wonderful to have broader participation, but it also then requires broader educational opportunities. And so we need to be sure to get out and talk about the benefits. I want to also commend the creation of the Federal State Joint Task Force on Transmission, which is essentially the FERC commissioners and the state PUCs, who have met repeatedly to try and hammer through some of the contentious issues that are facing the regulatory community. And again, to engage stakeholders in this decision-making process. So to quote Chairman Willie Phillips, so we can collaborate at the beginning and not litigate at the end.
Very good. Thanks, Barbara. Other solutions and thoughts about how to do this?
Well, so I think we've talked about a lot of really good things. The education is certainly key. I think people really don't, unless you're in the industry, you don't think about transmission unless you see it. You just enjoy the benefits of why it's there. But I would just like to highlight transparency. I think we had, with our recent filing at FERC, changing our open access tariff about our local transmission planning effort, we tried to add in additional transparency. We are working with stakeholders. So some of the items that Christina highlighted in the report, where she walks through the stakeholder engagement, working with stakeholders to push through this, I think it is important. I know that we can all feel sometimes that it's not always a collaborative process, but I think the more you implement it, the more collaborative it becomes. The more opportunity you also have to educate across, like was just mentioned, the diverse group of stakeholders that we have. So that transparency, I think, is important. And then I would say a little bit of trust, right? So a lot of times if we're not involved, we're not collaborating, we have very little trust that somebody's trying to reach the same end goal that we're trying to reach, maybe just a different way. So a little bit of trust goes a long way. And I think the stakeholder engagement and collaboration helps build that over time.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. In order to be able to continue to keep the lights on in the future, it's going to take a heck of a lot of collaboration. We're going to all have to work together to get this done. We can't do it by ourselves. And that's, to me, that is one of the values that regionalization provides. You have a lot of stakeholders and asset owners and decision makers all working together for a common purpose, and that common purpose is keeping the lights on. So Aubrey and David, anything else to add?
Sure. David, you got thoughts? I have thoughts.
I always have thoughts. You can go first, Aubrey, and I'll follow.
So I'll take us a little bit different direction and come back home to RTO space. But one of the comments that I make quite a bit is if I could be king for a day, and you talk about solutions, I really call upon the Department of Commerce to really lean into the Job Training Partnership Act and flood the field with linemen, relay technicians, and inverter technicians. If you think about the pathway going forward, we actually don't have enough people to do the work that we're called upon to do when you talk about this massive energy transfer. And so all of the work that we think about going forward is going to be different than what we've seen historically. And so if we want to think about how to keep the lights on, you're going to have a different set of skill sets. All the relaying that we'll see going forward in the new future will all be digital. And so everyone has to have programming capability. You got all the cybersecurity, all those things that are built into it. And so that skill set is going to be different. We're moving to high inverter-based resources. Who do we have to do both the installations and the troubleshooting and maintenance when they break? And they are going to break, right? And so how do we think about those things from a reliability perspective? The other thing that I'd love to do is I'd love to invoke the Defense Production Act, and really, how do we double down on the domestic production of high voltage transformers, right? And really thinking about the things that we actually need to enable the things that are going forward. How do we think about changing our transportation plan so that a transformer that comes in the Port of LA, the Port of Houston, does not take 3 months to get across the country? How do you think about all these things that are actual practical blocking and tackling that are necessary for the amount of consumables and goods that you got to have to enable the space that we're going? And I think all of those things make David and his colleagues' life easier because they actually have the resources that they can have more certainty on what's there as they think about the projects and stuff they're going to build off of. And then when you come back internally, I think we have to think about how we execute the changes within the processes that we need going forward. And so David and his colleagues were parties to, and I think they might have felt like at times that they were parties being partied against, if you will, when you think about some of the interconnection queue reforms that we made a filing on last week. And here we're making a significant change to our interconnection process, and we did it in a better part of 7 months. And that's really rapid in the MISO space of trying to do something in that regard. A lot of individual meetings, a lot of stakeholder meetings to do that. But we've got to recognize that I think, and I don't know the answers, but I do think that some of our historical processes won't sustain themselves going forward. And we have to take some shots at changing those and recognize the turbulence that that's going to create in our stakeholder process as we move to do those things. But I think they're absolutely necessary. Again, I'll go back, Lanny, the way that you all are trying to take a look at the consolidated planning process. We think some of that takes place in the work that we're doing with the LRTP process, but those are going to be big swings. And our concern today is the culture shock. If you're talking about our tranche one was $10.3 billion, I got folks in my bat lab telling me that our tranche two could be a really, really big number. It can be 2-3x than that. And what do we think that the market can sustain? And so trying to get people to have a story and to understand that those are big numbers, but they're spread over 20 plus years, over a large footprint, and they're doing a great deal of enablement for all of the things that you're trying to do. And then I think also when we have all of this discussion about the cost of transmission, we need to remind folks about the cost of generation. And if done optimally, you bring the overall cost of all of that down. And so how do we think about those things more collaboratively and really think about all of the blocking and tackling that's necessary for all of the things that we're queuing up to be done going forward?
Thank you, Aubrey. David, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm really tempted after Aubrey's comments to just over to what I think about their MISO Q filing, but I'm not going to, so don't worry, Aubrey.
I know you love it. I know you love it.
My last comment would be this is just really hard to do at the regional level. The smaller the view on transmission, the narrower the view of that value of transmission, and the more that incumbent interests kind of factor into the value of the planning of transmission. The party that's in the best position to kind of overcome that, in my opinion, is the federal government. The number one change I would ask for is the pending transmission planning NOPR that's sitting out there and hasn't had any movement. Would be the biggest thing that I could see that could pass, that could move the needle on some of this planning. I mean, I'm not saying that we can't do this at the regional level, and MISO has been very successful, and SPP has also planned a lot of transmission over the last decade. But it is a barrier. And then my final point that I would make is the independence of the entity that's planning transmission, whether that's a utility or an RTO, really matters. I would argue that one of the reasons that MISO was so successful in getting this portfolio across the finish line is that they enjoy a high level of independence from incumbent interest and can take a holistic, broad view of the value of that transmission and truly try to optimize it. You don't see that everywhere, and it's a problem. And then also the independence of who's building the transmission matters too. In a couple markets, we've seen transmission that's gotten approved that is proven to provide value, doesn't get built because the incumbent doesn't want to build it and doesn't understand the value. That's a big problem for us in SPP in California right now, where transmission delays are hampering. I mean, transmission that's approved, the delays are just hurting our business models. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you, David. And Michael, that wraps up all the questions that I have. I know there's not a whole lot of time left, but if there's one or two questions that maybe we can address fairly quickly, I'm happy to try to do that.
I'll throw out, well, it's a two-part question, so it'll be a little long, but hopefully we can deal with it quickly, and I'll just leave your faces on the screen rather than mine. We've used that analogy of the highway system a few times now. And if you think about it, a lot of cities have terrible congestion on that interstate highway system. So how can we think about the distinction between some of that localized congestion versus the larger system problem? And I'll add to that, pricing hasn't really come up as an issue. And even on the interstate system, right, we have toll roads that help us deal with some of that transmission aspect of the highway system and to mitigate some of the traffic on the line. So, as we think about, the grid system, how do we distinguish between these localized problems versus the larger systems problems? And to what extent, does the way we price and the market pricing itself affect some of that decision making?
Well, I can certainly respond from ACOR's standpoint, which is we've done some studies indicating that if we do have more regional cooperation and planning, we can definitely bring down the cost than if we have one-off system efforts underway. So I think comprehensive planning, to your point, Michael, is exceedingly important in both the effectiveness and performance of a system, but also lowering the costs.
All right, Michael, I'll leave it up to you. It's 12:45.
Well, I want to thank you all for a very stimulating and interesting conversation. I appreciate all the different perspectives brought to the table today. And Lanny, thank you for your leadership in moderating this conversation. I think it's been great. We're going to transition now to our regulatory panel. So we'll wish you all farewell from our screens anyway, and hope you're able to stick around for the conversations later. And I'll invite our next panel to come to their screens, turn on their cameras. Hopefully all of your cameras enable well here. Let's see, Commissioner Pridemore, I know is online. We just need to get, there she is, fantastic. So I want to thank you all for being here today as well. I know you're all very busy. And I'll let our moderator introduce the rest, but our moderator this afternoon is Commissioner Emeritus Gladys Brown-Dutrell from the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. She's a native of Middletown, Pennsylvania, and graduated, got her bachelor's in political science from the University of Pittsburgh and her Juris Doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh as well. I worked at Pitt for a few years, and my son went there, so I have fond feelings for that. So I'm glad we share that, Commissioner Emeritus. Upon graduation, she returned to the Harrisburg area and served as assistant counsel for the Department of State Bureau of Professional Occupational Affairs. After 2 years, she accepted an opportunity to clerk for Judge Paul A. Simmons, a federal judge in the U.S. District Court of Western Pennsylvania. She joined the legal staff of the Senate Democratic Caucus in the spring of 1991, and she remained with the legal staff until October of 2013, when she was appointed to the Public Utility Commission by Governor Corbett. She was appointed as chair in 2015 and served until 2023. So she's just recently set down that gavel and can now speak more freely, right? Chair Dutrell was also on the FERC-NARUC Transmission Task Force in 2021 and 2022, so she brings that to our conversation. And we're looking forward to this panel's discussion. Commissioner Emeritus Dutrell, I'll turn it over to you to run the show from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and greetings to everyone. It is good to see a lot of faces that I've worked with in the MACRUC and NARUC circles. Thank you also for the invitation to serve as the moderator for this panel on transmission issues, which I think I talked about the last couple of years as my time at the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. I think I talked about transmission more than any other issue. But I am happy to be here, happy to be with the regulators. As I was talking to Michael when we were planning this, I said, it's a fine line that the regulators walk, trying to just deal with all the issues. And you could hear that in the discussion earlier with some of the other panels, especially the industry panel. I was smiling because I kept saying, some of the same questions will be asked in my session, but it will come from a different viewpoint. And so I'm looking forward to it. I know the regulators in the panel are looking forward to it as well. So let me just take the opportunity to introduce everyone. We have a great panel here. With us today, we have Commissioner Tricia Pridemore, who joined the Georgia Public Service Commission in 2018. She was unanimously elected as chairman of the commission by her fellow commissioners in July of 2021 and served as the chair until this year. Previously, she served as a telecommunications committee chair and focused on telecommunications matters, including rural broadband. In addition to her duties with the commission, she serves on the advisory board of the Financial Research Institute at the University of Missouri, who is the host of today's panel or today's session. She is also on the gas committee of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, as well as the NARUC Subcommittee on Education and Research. She is the NARUC liaison to the University of Wisconsin School of Public Utilities. And for the next couple of days, she is the second vice president of NARUC. In 2020, she was appointed to the U.S. Department of Energy and the NARUC Natural Gas Partnership, which is a partnership designed to facilitate the exchange of information on emerging regulatory and technological solutions. And she also served, along with me, on the NARUC Joint Task Force on Transmission. We also have with us Chairman Scott Rupp or Roop, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, I do apologize, who serves as a commissioner on the Missouri Public Services Commission since 2014, and he was appointed the chair in January of 2023, so we congratulate him. Previously, he served 2 terms in the Missouri State Senate and 2 terms as a state representative. He earned his Master's of Science degree in Energy and Sustainability from the University of Denver and his MBA from Lindenwood University. He's a member of the 2017 graduating class of the National Renewable Energy Labs, the Executive Leadership Program, and a 2016 graduate of the Flatirons Institute Regulatory Law and Economics Leadership Program, and we welcome him. We also have with us Chairman Dan Scripps, who was appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to the Michigan Public Service Commission in February of 2019. And he has served as the chair since July of 2020. As a commissioner, he has been an active participant in multiple state energy advisory groups, including the Michigan Council on Climate Solutions and the Upper Peninsula Energy Task Force, the Michigan Dam Safety Task Force, and an interdepartmental work group on propane security. He currently serves as the president of both the Organization of MISO and the Mid-America Regulatory Conference. He previously chaired the Regional Expansion Criteria and Benefits Working Group for the Mid-Continent Interdependent System Operator, or MISO, helping to develop consensus around cost allocation, which is an important issue for today, for the largest ever portfolio of electric transmission projects in USA history. He is a member of the board of directors for NARUC and serves on the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmission and the Task Force on Emergency Preparedness and Preparedness, Recovery, and Resiliency. He is a member of NARUC's committees on critical infrastructure, gas, and international relations, and the Washington Action Program. He has also been an active participant in NARUC's international programs, participating in regulatory engagement in 4 continents. And last but not least, we have Chairman Emil Thompson with us. He was appointed to the Public Service Commission of the District of Columbia by Mayor Bowser in 2021 and reappointed as interim chairman in December 2021. He was confirmed as the chair in June of 2022. He's an active member of NARUC, representing public service commissions that regulate telecommunications, energy, and water utilities. He serves as NARUC's co-vice chair of the Committee on Critical Infrastructure, near and dear to my heart, which was established after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks to provide state regulators a forum to analyze solutions to utility infrastructure security and delivery concerns. He's a member of the NARUC Committee on Energy Resources and the Environment, which focuses on energy efficiency, environmental protection, renewable and distributed resources, consumer protection, and low-income weatherization and assistance. He also serves on the board of directors of the Organization of PJM States, which promotes and protects the public interest in providing reliable and reasonably priced electric service. So we do thank all of our panelists today. As I started out with some of the comments that I mentioned, when listening to the previous panel, especially the industry panel, and also the comments from our presenter earlier, Christine, I did chuckle, and not in a bad way, but I chuckled because I thought, oh my gosh, if they were asked one of the regulators this question, it probably would have a different answer. And that's why it's important that we have this regulatory panel here today. You might hear some of the same questions, but there's definitely going to be a different focus in terms of things that we do. So let's just start with setting the framework for our panel as I've said earlier, you probably have heard some of the questions, but there's definitely going to be a different focus or direction in terms of the answer. So I'll just throw it out to our panelists today in terms of setting the stage. We talked a lot about the value of transmission, which is our reason for being here today. But I'd like to hear about how you and your different states or different regions that you are in, how they would deal or answer that question of the value of transmission. And I don't know who wants to go first. I don't want to go necessarily in the order because it will always be Commissioner Pridemore who has to answer first, even though I know she's up to the challenge. But I'll just jump around a little bit. I see Dan's laughing a lot, so I'll ask Chairman Scripps. You want to answer that question first?
This is what I get for laughing. So, I think it's always been about sort of reliability first and foremost, and the ability to move electrons from where they're being generated to where they're being used. And it's been pretty straightforward, and I think that's how the system has operated for the last 100 years. And I think it's still the foundational sort of principle of how transmission works. But I think you've started to see in the last 15 years or so maybe a broadening of how we think about transmission, that it still plays that reliability function first and foremost, but that transmission can have multiple values. And in fact, when you go back to the multi-value project or MVP portfolio that MISO put together in the 2010-2011 timeframe, it sort of recognized that it played a role both in reliability, but also in sort of economic or cost containment purposes, and then also had some role in sort of connecting sort of the emerging resources, particularly wind at that time, to the larger grid. And those resources often sort of were the result of state public policy decisions and were located in places other than where the traditional transmission system had been built, but trying to optimize across a number of those different variables. And you've seen MISO go sort of further since then with the development of the MEP or market efficiency projects. These are projects that really are being driven by opportunities to gain efficiency in the system or economic value, even sort of, but they also do and can play a reliability function. And then in the long-range transmission planning process that MISO is continuing with, but the Tranche 1 projects that were approved last year, again, looking at multiple values for both across sort of economics and reliability. And the last thing that I'll say on this is that what's interesting about transmission is even the projects that are built for one purpose, often sort of economic or moving electricity from west to east within the MISO footprint. In emergency situations, those same lines operate almost exactly in reverse, that they're moving power from east to west in order to preserve reliability in emergency events. And so I think that sort of underscores the multiple roles that transmission can play and the multiple roles that each individual line can play, even when it's built for one purpose, that its sort of best value in emergency situations may look something quite different.
I agree with you. Thanks, Dan. Who wants to go next? I'm looking at Scott, Emil, Trisha. Scott's the only one that's unmuted, so he goes next.
There you go. Great. I mean, what Dan said was spot on. So I'll take a different approach, and from how a regulator kind of looks at like transmission is kind of like how a teenager looks at their parent. It's like they don't want us around. They don't want to see us. They want to be off doing their own thing. But if they need us, oh man, they want us there. And it's that relationship you have to have, especially with the public, is you have to impress the need of why this has to be here. You have to impress the value. You have to impress that, hey, this is what's going to be happening, but nobody wants to see it. Nobody wants it around, but they still want the benefits of it. And so it's navigating that relationship of trying to explain the need, the value for the investment of someone that just really doesn't want to ever have to think about it. So it's difficult from a regulator standpoint of trying, when you have to convince somebody of the value of something, you already have lost, half the battle. And so that's where the reliability piece that Dan was talking about comes in, because, unfortunately, when there isn't reliability, then, it's kind of flips the coin and they're like, oh, wow, we need to have you there. But then they're upset that why weren't you there? And so you have to kind of walk this balance of, presenting the case, why it needs to be there, but you're not going to see it. You're never going to hear about it. And oh yeah, by the way, it's not going to cost you anything, which is an impossible conversation, to have. So from the regulator standpoint, and my heart goes out to those regulators that have to be elected. I mean, how do you approach someone with that, where you're also trying to convince them that, hey, I'm the person to solve it? When you are appointed, you have some, level of, hey, we can make these decisions that are going to maybe upset you, but trust me, in the long run, you're going to want it to be there. So it's a very, persnickety type of a relationship. And as anybody's had teenagers, I mean, that's the only thing I can relate it to.
So when you mentioned elected members of the Public Utility Commissions, I thought immediately of Commissioner Pridemore, because they are elected in Georgia. So I'm going to take it to you, and Emil, you get ready to answer next.
Thank you, Gladys. It's great to see all these smiling faces that I love so much. The value of transmission in Georgia is, it's easy for us to calculate. See, in Georgia, our system is we are physical owners of transmission and not just the financial managers of it. This is a physical, if you think about it from the utility standpoint, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but if you think about it from their standpoint, they physically own the transmission, and the decision about transmission comes before us, the five of us at the Georgia Public Service Commission. And so we do that through a comprehensive integrated resource plan. It's every 3 years, but sometimes based upon load growth need, including transmission, we'll see increases that will come in and come before us. We're expecting one next year, as a matter of fact. But for those that don't know about how Georgia operates, in addition to a comprehensive integrated resource planning process, we also have a coordinated system operating process. So our investor-owned utility, coupled with the 38 EMCs or co-ops that are not part of the TVA footprint. We have 3 that are part of the TVA footprint. And then all of our municipals. All of that is completely coordinated. The previous panel talked a lot about collaboration, I noticed. And if you want to talk about collaboration, you want to come down and tour GSOC and see how our system operation actually works. And all of that is physically owned by either the members of the co-ops or the ratepayer. And so it's the way that it operates is pretty impressive, I think. And it also, I think, allows us to continue our mission and our theme, which has always been to manage ourselves and to do the hard things that need to be done.
So Commissioner Pridemore, with your co-ops, it still comes under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission there in Georgia?
We do not rate set for the co-ops.
Okay.
We approve their financing authority, their ability to borrow, and therefore approve their capital worthiness. But we do not do their rates. But those are set by the local boards of 41 co-ops. And they buy into the transmission the same way that the investor-owned utility does, the same way that the city councils and the municipals do.
Thank you very much. Chairman Thompson, give you an opportunity to weigh in on this question.
No, certainly. Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. It's good to see everybody. I think when we talk about the value of transmission, it's a little hard to quantify all of the value, right? Of course, there's the cost of the steel and the conduits, but what about the cost or the value that's then brought to the system because of that reliability that Commissioner Scripps talked about, and the enabling of allowing businesses to run, right? And so the value, when you start looking at it that way, is really expansive. I think when you look at DC, DC is very unique because for all intents and purposes, of course, we operate like a state, but unlike any other state, we are a completely dense urban environment. We have no utility size generation, whether it's from fossil fuels or renewables. And so as a result, we rely very heavily on transmission throughout the region to ensure that we have the power, the electricity needed to keep the lights on in DC. And so you take that combined with being the nation's capital, we're starting to talk about a high value level when we start talking about transmission. That coupled with our very ambitious energy transition goals around whether it's our RPS standards or around electrification, again, we are looking to import the majority of this electricity. And so the value of transition the value of transmission is extremely high. I think looking at it prospectively, we have to be very mindful of, especially in the PJM region, of all the different constituencies that are part of PJM and what different constituencies want when we start talking about transmission. And so this is all a long way of me saying very, very valuable, and it's extremely important. And being here in the nation's capital, not generating, we view it's very important to us.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a lot today in terms of the report card. All of you are from different areas within the country, so you have a different rating. We give congratulations to Chairman Scripps. Got a nice little B over there, and I was like, wow, okay, that's pretty good. But let's delve into that a little bit. There are a lot of challenges that regulators have in terms of transmission, the build out of it. We've talked about the need for transmission and the value of it. And, I always joked about the fact that, the same people that would not want necessarily to build out of transmission because of the cost for it would probably be the same people that will be complaining if the lights went out and there's not the electricity that they need to operate their everyday lives. But let's talk about a little bit more from the point of view of a regulator. I mean, I might have joked about it, but I don't know if I've ever said that on the bench at all. So because there's a lot of challenges that we have to deal with. So as a regulator, what's preventing the development of transmission? I know I was writing down notes from the industry side, and there was a comment in terms of, no one wants to see it in their backyard necessarily. The concerns with that and the build out of the physical lines that one would see. Talk about, from your point of view, your state, your region, what's been preventing the development of what we believe, or some would believe, is the need for additional transmission and the build out of it. And I see Commissioner Pridemore opened up her line. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go first on this one. It's okay.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, I'm going to go first because the Southeast got a big fat F from this report.
I didn't want to point that out, but yes, you did.
Hey, Dan. Hey, I see that smile. So I want to talk about the report card, not just because Dan got a B and he's very worthy of good grades, but the methodology of the study. When it came out this summer and I first read it and talked to some folks at the commission about it, it was kind of like we just read it and kept trucking. As one of my staffers said, well, what are we going to do? Haters going to hate. But really, it's the way that the way that the study was constructed. And so it was constructed looking at an RTO and a market structure being the preferred structure versus a non-structured market, but still has a great deal of coordination and collaboration. When I think about the way that we in the Southeast are able to build out transmission, first and foremost, those projects that don't get built out, it's simply because they're uneconomic. And I can tell you that through our comprehensive IRP process. I can tell you that from the other Southeastern commissioners. There's a great deal of collaboration across the commissions in the Southeast and a great deal of knowledge sharing, especially with those that are identified as Southeast in this report. Really, I think that it's just a lack of understanding of our planning processes and how it operates, whether it's transmission investment, interconnection queue timelines, combined with all of these other key elements. We have been able to prove time and time again, we can build more transmission. We can continue to incorporate more renewables into our systems at a faster rate and faster clip so that we can provide more clean energy resources than we have before. And we're able to do it all by not being inside of a structured market in an RTO ISO. And so I really think it's just kind of a lack of understanding of how our process works. I really think too that the accountability piece in this, as Scott mentioned, we are elected, and a lot of the Southeastern commissioners are elected. And so we do have pretty in-depth conversations about transmission and about how transmission routes are determined. I'll tell you something, there's that'll wake you up is when you have a group of constituents that want to talk to you about the fact that they don't like where a line is being proposed and how it's going to impact their property. But I'll tell you time and time again, I mean, I've been served on the commission now for nearly 6 years. And we've been able to work through those issues with people. At the end of the day, I think that if people are being given a good value and there is reliability, affordability, and safety in mind, we've been able to work through them. And in talking with commissioners, talking with commissioners that have served longer than I have in other Southeastern states, and a lot of us have been on our commissions for a long time, we're always able to work through those issues with our constituents and with the utilities. The utilities have to be flexible. They have to collaborate not only with each other, but also with us.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Chairman Thompson.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the report. I think there, a lot of hard work went into it, and certainly things that we agree with. I believe the Mid-Atlantic PJM, we got a D+, which puts us right in the middle between Michigan and the Southeast. So, or MISO in the Southeast. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. Certainly things we agree with. And I think Commissioner Pridemore, though, she made some excellent points in regarding the methodology behind that study. But as to the question of what's really prevented the development of their transmission system, there are a number of reasons, one of which Christine talked about earlier when she was talking about her report. There was a large transmission build out and there was a lot of headroom on the system. And that coupled with energy efficiency, DR programs, and other things kind of took care of the need for real intensive long-term planning for a while. But that headroom is starting to run out. And so now we have to do it. Also, I think a lot of planning happened in isolation. When we think about the grid as originally conceived in terms of you would have a power plant feeding the localized load. And so the transmission planning was done in a very localized manner. Now that we have different generation sources, loads have been decentralized, and generation is being more spread out, you can't do it that way. And I think, again, for a long time, it's been hard for people to think about this big expense when there's not an immediacy about it. And so that's certainly changed. And then, even when you look at transmission planning now, and I'll speak more so about PJM, it's done in a very siloed manner, right? I think one of the things the report kind of highlighted is that the multi-value approach is kind of like the gold standard, right? And or at least from the report, I see Commissioner Pridemore made a little face there. But I think that that's something that PJM is starting to look at, right? How do we really take a look at all of the requisite things, economics, reliability, policy goals, and really take a holistic planning to that. And I think that's one of the things that PJM has really started to do over the last a couple of years. And so hopefully we'll start to see some changes there.
Scott, Dan, want to chime in here on this question?
Yes, I'll chime in. Commissioner Thompson, he had mentioned on something is kind of makes me worry is that we have this huge investment. We have this need for this investment, but there's also that concern in the back of your mind. Am I going to overinvest? Because if I have congestion and 2 years from now, 3 years from now, a small modular reactor could be put on the other side of the congestion, and then I don't have to route as much power there. Or if battery storage becomes good enough to where, some of those congestion things can be alleviated. So it's kind of like you're looking at your car going, well, should I just tinker with it? Maybe I can get another year or two out of it, or do I bite the bullet and really invest into this into the system? So in Missouri, we're in 2 RTOs. We have co-ops that don't, and we have a seams issue and stuff. So we're dealing with a lot of these congestion issues, and we just approved the grain belt to run across the state and things of that nature. So you have to balance that, that immediate need of reliability and what do we have, but also looking out to the future of I don't want to overbuild, at times because there could be a potential that that maybe that I might not need it in the time because this is such a big investment. So you kind of have to weigh those needs because a lot of the issues we're facing in Missouri is the congestion issue on the seams or in places where we're not seeing as much massive growth of population that's driving the need. So sometimes it's just managing that that system. So that's kind of on the back of our minds.
Chairman Scripps.
Yeah, maybe just a couple points. In addition to the other points that folks made, which I largely agree with. First, I think even sort of when you dig into the report a little bit more, you see sort of, I think, more granularity in comparing between regions. And so, for example, the Southeast gets an A-, the second highest grade awarded by the report for transmission capacity available for new resources. And so I think in each of our regions, we probably have places where we're stronger and other places where other regions are stronger. And I think that was one of my takeaways, is that sort of these in some ways reflect some of those regional differences. The other 2 points that I'd make, I guess one is there are challenges in optimizing. So if you're going for sort of the most reliable and least cost, which I think is probably a metric that we could all agree on, those are the two that we're trying to balance between. It's also sort of how you optimize between the different options available, and some of those are transmission, but some of theirs are also generation or things even on the distribution grid. And that is further complicated by some of the jurisdictional divides. We clearly, as state regulators, have full jurisdiction over resource adequacy and also for the operations of our distribution grid. But transmission functions are, even, often at the RTO, but even in non-RTO regions, and for those of us in RTOs as well, the rates are set ultimately by FERC. And so there's I think a tension in terms of how you optimize between the different options available and the jurisdictional overlays that further complicate that. And then the last thing I'll say is, interregional transmission has gotten a fair amount of attention recently. I think it's an important topic. But in those, the market designs between regions, so PJM, for example, the operators there, the generation operators, get a significant larger chunk of their revenue from the capacity market, whereas in MISO, it's from the energy market. But that wrinkle just alone means that maybe you're okay with a little more congestion in PJM than on the MISO side, and Michigan sits on the seam between those two. And so I think those functions, and then the sort of way that different markets or non-RTO regions plan, syncing up just the sort of mechanics of the planning functions is a really challenging thing. It sounds really simple, like why can't you just run an interregional line? But doing that in a way that sort of syncs up with the planning, whether it's on the MISO SPP seam or the MISO seam with PJM or the MISO seam with Southern Company in the Southeast, there are real challenges that operationally just create barriers to building out a system that might be more optimized for customers.
One thing that I didn't hear, well, I think Commissioner Pridemore touched upon it a little bit when she was saying with the Georgia commissioners, they are elected. So they have the more direct impact in terms of constituents and things of that nature. I think in other areas where, even though the commissioners are appointed, they also have the the relationships dealing with the concerns from the members of the General Assemblies, from their constituents and things of that nature. But one of the things I wanted to pursue just a little bit more along the same line is the transitioning from administration to administration, because, we did in this country, long-term planning of transmission a while back, but I would think that each time there's a change in your local area, meaning your state, an administration, and there's a learning curve, and they may be going in a different direction because they may not understand it or something of that nature. Is that, I would think that would be one of the areas of challenges that you as regulators have to deal with. So I just wanted to delve a little bit into that, if you saw any of those type of challenges.
We don't really in Georgia, because if you're talking about transitioning like gubernatorial administrations.
Yes.
Yeah. So our governor's elected and we're elected. We don't have an Office of Energy Policy that sits aside from that. All of that work for energy for the state's done at the commission level. And I'm sorry, by the way, that I'm sitting in a restaurant. My flight was delayed 3 times. I'm actually down the road from Commissioner Thompson, waiting on a room in a Marriott.
We can't tell that you're in a restaurant.
But... funny, I'm also in DC, so all of us could have just gone over to Chairman Thompson's office. Together.
I'm 2 hours away. I'll just drive down and meet you guys, right?
That would have been amazing. One point that I think that we should talk about that it relates to this, Commissioner Dutrell, is the geographic differences. So in the Southeast, our load centers probably look more like Scott's, where they're far apart and they're high capacity, high management. So when you think about that, that's true for all across the Southeast, where like in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, your load centers are denser. You're just geographically denser in places. That makes it even trickier when it comes to doing transmission planning.
I agree. Chairman Thompson, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, so in terms of I guess changing administrations in DC, whereas the mayor has been the same mayor for 8 years and she just recently won re-election, so that's not as much of a challenge. It's more so with the city council, as because we don't have a state legislature. City council is kind of our constituency. Really educating them on some of the policies that have been enacted. I talked earlier about being a net importer. And so when we say we're gonna have 100% electricity from renewable sources by 2032, but we can't have utility scale solar, there's a little disconnect in terms of how we're gonna meet those goals. And so that's when I have to go and talk to them about the regional transmission organization. What is PJM? Why are we a member? Why that's different than pre-1999 when restructuring happened, and provide that educational background. And so there's certainly a learning curve, but I have found them to be, certainly good partners and very least willing to listen.
I'll jump in next.
Okay.
It's Commissioner Rooker. Yeah, I've served under 3 governors, and I've never once gotten a phone call from a governor. They respect the independent nature of our agency, and they never really influence any type of political influence, which I think is a benefit for them, because they can just defer anybody over to the PSC and say, oh no, that's where you have to go. They're independent. We don't, I appoint them, but they do their own thing. So we've never seen any change, in any type of, and that's just the respect that we're given. Even though we're not elected, and like you would never tell another elected state official, what to do, because hey, you won your election, that's your role. But we've been given that deference in our state from Republican, Democrat governors on the like, which has made things much easier, especially when you get very very issues that upset a lot of people when you're building massive lines through century-old farms and things of that nature. So that's something that we've experienced, which has been a blessing.
Okay, very good. So let's move on to our next question. And I know we've had some discussion in previous panels in terms of the proposed NOPR the NOPR not proposed by FERC. So my question here is, will FERC's proposed interconnection rules help or hurt? To whom or and why?
I'll jump in.
The only thing I
Yes.
would say is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That kind of always has bothered me. So that probably, makes me kind of have a certain viewpoint of things. So rather than get into the details, I would say that's kind of, where I start from is from a viewpoint. So for us here, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
From a from the southeastern standpoint, because of SRTEP and the existence of SRTEP, that's southeastern southeastern regional transmission planning process. All of those utilities, and they all have some degree of comprehensive IRPs like we have in Georgia. That's not going to change the way that they operate. It's not going to change their planning processes and how they're going to implement. I think to Chair Roop's point, it's just one more thing to do.
Neil, Dan?
I think I have a little bit more optimistic view. Of course, that's premised on it actually coming out, right? We've been waiting on it for a while, so there's certainly that hurdle. But I think at least in my view, it certainly incorporates some of the things that are done elsewhere. Of course, with instead of being a first come, first serve, it's first ready, first serve, which I think is going to be huge. But I think like most things, have to wait and see. But it also can't be a stale document. It will have to be an iterative process. We talked earlier, or Christine and people talked earlier about how FERC Order 1000 came out and it just kind of was flat. I think with interconnection, it has to be the same thing. It has to be an iterative process. It has to be continued to improve. As you know, Gladys, PJM is doing their own interconnection reform right now. And, you have to continue to refine those practices and look at best practices to ensure that we're getting the right resources on the grid in a timely and efficient manner. And so the jury is still out. I hope it will help. There's still a lot of other challenges around interconnection. Again, in PJM, even though we have signed ISAs, there's about 40 gigawatts waiting with signed ISAs that have not broken ground for various reasons, whether it's supply chain, siting, what have you. And that's nothing that NOPR can help, right? Those are other external issues. And so there's just a lot going on in that interconnection space right now.
I would agree with everything that Chair Thompson said. That I think it's going to help on the margins. I think it'll help more than just on the margins in terms of sort of providing some parameters around how the interconnection process should work. But we're in the same position in MISO. We've got 49 gigawatts that has cleared the queue, but is hung up for all the reasons that Chair Thompson was talking about. And I think the other piece of this is I think it will help. But the biggest way to help on queues is to build more capacity. And so we were in this situation. We built the MVP projects, most of them, one still dragging on. But that helped a great deal in terms of now you could actually interconnect. And the same thing here. I think the LRTP projects, the Tranche 1 projects, the Tranche 2 projects that are under consideration, if and when they get built, will do probably more for the interconnection queue issue than sort of any queue reforms could. And so it's probably a both and. You need both, but you can try and solve all the queue issues. But if you're not also, that it may not go as far as you think because of supply chain issues, local siting and permitting issues. And if the system continues to be congested, getting through the queue, but not actually be able to move the electrons doesn't help either.
So my last question probably is moving into the small group discussion, but I'm going to ask it anyway, in case some of our regulators that are on the line cannot stay for the small group discussions. I'm assuming, Michael, you don't have a problem with that. So my last question to the panelists, excuse me, is generally, how can we move forward? I mean, you've heard the discussion from the previous panel, the industry side, in your role and your capacity as regulator, transmission discussion of it is not going to go away. Trying to deal with it holistically as a country in terms of our needs, in terms of transmission, it's not going to go away unless we continue to have this conversation and move it forward in terms of addressing the needs. So how do we move forward?
I'm going to jump in first if I can, in part because I double booked.
You have to go,
somehow.
yes.
Yeah. So, in addition to the NOPR on the interconnection, FERC also has been considering for a couple of years some additional issues around transmission planning, and including cost allocation in a regional planning. I think those can help as well. If we can find the cost allocation issues are huge, and if figuring I still think it's probably best done locally, but I think FERC has a unique role for interregional projects, both on the planning and the cost allocation, on how to sort of be a forcing mechanism to get regions talking to each other in a way that ultimately yields results and projects. And that I think is important, but also just, I don't want them duplicating, and I certainly don't want them slowing down processes like are underway in MISO and in PJM and in other regions. But to the extent that they can sort of identify what's going to be needed in order to maintain reliability even as the system changes in ways that respect local differences and regional differences, I think that can be a really good thing too. With that, I'm sorry that I'm jumping off early before
Thanks,
Trisha
Dan.
disagrees with me, but I'll see you all soon.
Well,
Trisha, do you want to answer him while he's about to?
I actually don't want to disagree with Dan. I mean, I think that from the perspective of is that, Dan states it's in an RTO. And so there are different considerations that he has to make for reliability and to serve his customer than I have to make in the Southeast. So I don't disagree with him there. I think that how we move forward is to continue to collaborate, continue to have transparency, and I'll be as bold to say, not let things like this report that has a very subjective point of view, looking for an intended outcome, to get in the way of us continuing to work together and collaborate with utility, with constituents, with commissions, and with all the regulators. I think that the work that's happening with the FERC NARUC Transmission Task Force will continue. I know Dan is on that, and others, and I just think that there's a path forward. This is hard, and it's supposed to be hard. When you think about what it is that we're trying to accomplish in serving the public, but we do hard things in the Southeast. We do hard things in Georgia. We just finished the nation's first new nuclear unit in 30 years. We've got another one coming online next quarter. So I think when it's all said and done, we're going to be able to accomplish our goals. We're going to have a cleaner energy future. We're going to be able to serve the public and maintain reliability, safety, and affordability. It's just going to take a lot of work.
Thank you. Scott, you want to?
I just focus on how good the sausage tastes and not how it's made. And I mean, really, it's just, it comes out, we're going to figure it out. It's going to be ugly, and we're going to fight and stuff. But at the end of the day, we end up with a good product and good stuff. You got to have that overarching picture of the reliability from the national standpoint. Because when you get bogged down into what's most economical and who's going to pay for it on some of these other projects. So as long as you have that in the background of making sure everything is reliable, we're going to have our fights and our organizations, but we're going to get it done. And at the end of the day, we will have a good product like we've had. This is our grid's the best invention of the last 100 years, and it's the marvel of the world. And we'll continue to deliver. Just don't pay attention to how the sausage is made.
I like that. Chairman Thompson.
I don't think I can beat the sausage comment, but I'll certainly try. I mean, I think it comes down to, of course, planning, right? And making sure we're planning with actual granular information to really inform the decision-making process so that we're planning appropriately to not overbuild, but to achieve our goals. Of course, I think siding reform is an issue. We certainly heard a lot more about that last panel to remove the obstacles to getting that transmission built. And then around cost, looking at cost allocation, maybe it's more around the state agreement approach, but also transparency, right? Ensuring that regulators are comfortable and have the appropriate input with some of these projects and their cost, because ultimately people come back to us.
If I could jump in here as well, just kind of summarizing what I've heard you say in this last question, because it's important. We as regulators know that, our jobs don't start and end within the boundaries of our state, because that's why we are participating on a regional level and a national level. Not only does it help us as regulators to learn about some of those issues that we may not deal with or even know that are percolating in our own state, but also avenues and tools of how we can deal with it when we have to deal with it. So I love the use of the different words that all of you have thrown out there. Collaboration was the one that jumps out the most, because it requires that we talk to each other. That's important. Even when it's been identified in terms of who would be sitting on the FERC-NARUC transmission task force, NARUC thought it was important that all of the country was represented in terms of the 5 different regions that makes up the organization, because everyone's different. The issues that are going on around the country are different. Some are in RTO, some are not. You could hear from the answers from the panelists in terms of would it hurt or help in terms of planning, in terms of transmission. So collaboration, continuing to discuss these things are important, because I think that each and every time you'll hear something different or come up with a different resolution to something that we can all deal with. So I do want to thank my panelists. I know I probably have like 5 more minutes. Michael, do we have any questions in the chat for that we can ask while we're closing out our session?
None have been posted, but if you do have a question, I encourage you to type it into the chat or to the Q&A. We do have just a couple minutes if our commissioners can stick with us just that long.
I think I saw one comment.
There we go. One came in just as we were saying that. So absent significant technology developments, can the energy industry accomplish the clean energy transition over the next couple decades without significant long transmission line development? Why or why not? And how are your state commissions planning to support the development of such transmission in a cost-effective manner?
I'll take it. No, we cannot. We have to have long-range transmission, and I really think the key to this is comprehensive integrated resource planning. Understand where the loads are expected, where you want to have your renewable resources, how you're going to move that, and then how you're going to be able to serve your industrials as well, which is a big piece of what is on the discussion right now in Georgia. So no, you have to have long-range transmission, and I think that that's just I think that's just a no-brainer, common sense. You're going to have utility scale solar. It's going to be in the country. Your loads are going to be in cities.
Anyone else want to answer that question?
I completely agree with Commissioner Pridemore. You're going to have it. And, our process in DC as part of our RTO is a little bit different than Georgia. I serve as on the organization of PJM states, the OPSI board, where we are frequent filers and commenters on various proposals by PJM. And so that's kind of our main way of really ensuring that this is done in a cost-effective way and ensuring that the projects that are being built are necessary. But to Trisha's point, it has to be. We are going to need the long transmission line development. That's to me a no-brainer.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. Michael, I don't know if there's no more questions in the chat feature, but I didn't know if you had a question.
Well, I have a follow-up question. Since Chair Root got to be quiet on that one, I'm going to kind of call him out on this. Now that the grain belt has been approved, that process took a decade, right? So what are lessons from that particular project that we might learn from that could be applied in future projects, future opportunities, not just in Missouri, but as you might see it across the board?
Well, I think the number one takeaway is, the commissions have to stand up for the best interests of their state. When that project was first approached to us, literally it was taking an extension cord from one state, running it across our state to plug into another state. And there was no benefit for us, no benefit for our ratepayers, no benefit for nothing. And we just, even though there might have been a bigger benefit to society in a whole, our state had to, see some type of benefit for us to bring it forth to our ratepayers, because how it was going to impact them. And so when we said no and said, you need to do better. And then they came back with, okay, we're going to drop off 505 whatever megawatts, and we'll do a substation. That's great. Change the dynamic and things. And then eventually, what was just finally approved was 2,500 megawatts being dropped off, into our state and running down, connecting, through AECI and then the SPP, and also into getting it over to PJM and into MISO. So by looking at a project very strictly, and not just saying, oh, okay, yeah, this is great, let's hop on board because it hits a renewable energy goal or it hits a reliability issue, to really look at it as, is this the best that it can be? That was the project kept getting better. It kept getting better from Missouri's standpoint, kept getting better. And I think what we just approved will benefit not just Missouri, but also, AECI and SPP and PJM and MISO. It's kind of an overall better project. But it took a while to get there. But you just couldn't be afraid of saying no, even though you knew it was probably going to, not achieve a certain goal that maybe certain groups wanted to have. So looking at them very, very strictly and applying, hey, it has to be good for everybody, not just certain groups, and then you end up getting a better project.
Thank you very much. And that takes us pretty much right up to our time. So I want to thank all of you for your time and participation today. This has been fantastic. I appreciate the different perspectives, and we didn't quite have debate, but we got pretty close. So I really appreciate that from all of you and the time that you took. So thank you all so much for participating in the panel. And we will let you go on for now, although we would certainly welcome you to stick around as long as you can to participate in the next stage of the workshop. And we're going to transition, and this is where I get nervous because this is a different venture for us, and we've not tried this before. But what we're hoping to do is get your input as participants in the workshop. What do we do with what we heard, and what are the ideas that are brought forward today, or maybe there were some things not brought forward that might be helpful from one perspective or another. So in order to facilitate that, we wanted to have some small group discussion, which obviously is a terribly difficult thing to do in an online environment. But I'm hoping that some of you will stick around, and we'll see how this goes to have that conversation. And as a few people are leaving, I'm kind of waiting to see where we settle on numbers to figure out how to set this up and how well this experiment is going to work. But what we're going to do at this point is we couldn't pre-assign rooms because I wasn't sure how many of you would still be here. But we seem to be settling in. I'm going to create 3 breakout rooms, and you're going to be automatically assigned. If you find yourself in a group where you might have some kind of an ex parte issue, flag me and we can switch you to a different group. But I'd like to spend, 25, 30 minutes in the small group settings developing a list. If you were to prioritize how we move forward, whether it's policy, whether it's planning tactics, whether it's kind of investments that are needed, what are those next steps that we could say, if we could all agree on, where do we have agreement? Where might we still need to have even more conversation to come to agreement on how to move this this planning process forward? So I'm going to click the small group button here in a second. You're going to be automatically assigned. I'm going to give each group about 25 minutes, and I'll give you a warning signal. And I'm going to ask you all to come back into the main group and report out. So I'll ask that among yourselves, you identify someone to be a note taker and reporter. Come back to our plenary here in about 25, 30 minutes and report out, and we'll see and we'll have open conversation at that point. Everybody's mics on and cameras on, so we can see who's still here and what we're interested in doing. So with that, looks like we're settling right around 15-ish. I'm going to create 3 breakout groups, and that should give us about 4 or 5 people in each, and we will have that conversation, and I look forward to it. I thank you for sticking around and participating. We look forward to hearing the outcome of your conversations.
Mike, did you want me to join any of the rooms, or we're just kind of letting them leave?
If you could join one of them, that would be great.
Okay, I will join room 3.
Okay. See if I can do this en masse. I'm not sure if I can unmute everybody, but I will ask everyone to unmute as they come in. So for those who have continued on through the conversation thus far, I want to thank you all for sticking around for this part of the conversation, because in my mind, this is the most important part of the day. So you are the most important people of the program. How's that? Is though we may be fewer and mightier than we were earlier in the afternoon. So I welcome you all back from your breakout rooms. Hopefully you had someone that was your designated note taker. And what I'd like to do at this point is have our note takers report out. And then as a large group, we can have some conversation about the ideas that came forward and see what those look like. So since I was sitting in the group with Commissioner Freeman and she's sitting in my top left corner, I'm going to ask her to report out first for our subgroup, and then we'll go to the other one.
Happy to do so, Dr. Sakuda. And given that I asked for this to happen, this little portion, I was going to stick around. So this was fun. And I really appreciate the care that you and Dr. Oler took in putting the groups together. We had a state regulator, a state representative, and individuals from a competitive developer and a vertically integrated utility. So it was a wonderful mix for purposes of this conversation.
I would like to take credit for that, but that was entirely Zoom randomly assigning people. So
Oh my
if
God,
the
no
other group
way.
didn't turn out as good, I'm sorry. It wasn't intentional.
I'm creeped out right now. That's too AI for me or whatever. No, well, then we were just really lucky. Our three main takeaways. First was the need for a clearer statement of the objective here, because this issue can be looked at in so many different ways, right? Depending on the geography or the site, whether it's regional, interregional, national, you've got geographic differences, and trying to get some type of balance in there, and having a clear statement of objective lets you know what exact problem you're trying to solve. And I like it too, because it's something that when we're working on this in other settings, we can actually do that. And it was a strong point of today's webinar workshop as well. I thought we came in with a definite problem statement. So that was one. Two was having the transparency of the impact on customers. That's a necessity. And again, something that is within our purviews. These are bites at the apple, not necessarily figuring out how tomorrow we're going to build transmission across our country, but things that we felt we could actually do. And then third is identifying opportunities to introduce certainty into a really uncertain process. And that can come through developing priorities or policies at the appropriate level, federal or state, regional, national, as well as having a requirement that there be a demonstration of a robust stakeholder process somewhere along the lines, not requiring it, but saying, show us what this looks like or what it doesn't look like and why. So those were three things that we came up with. And after we maybe hear from the other group and we start discussing things, then the other members of the group can provide more background on how we came up with those.
Sounds good. So from the other group, Adrian, I know you were in that group. Were you their designated reporter?
I self-designated as a note taker and potential paper writer. So we had Claire Eubanks, who is with the Missouri Commission, Anthony, who is in Iowa with as a consumer advocate there, and Sandra Osborne with EEI. That's correct, right? EEI. And so balanced as well. A lot of our conversation revolved around landowners, partly because of the Grain Belt Express and the lessons learned there. And really, I think from that, sort of reiterating what Scott kind of left us with, that it's really important that projects provide value beyond the money going to the landowner. So that it's important that the state see additional value from those projects, and that's more likely to get developed then because people will see value within that project. The other perspective, I think, considering landowners, is the potential for state siting authorities to consider energy corridors. that I was thinking about how gas stations kind of locate together. That you could have potentially agglomeration, but that state siting authorities could encourage that, and then that would sort of reduce redundancy in using farmland or turning very valuable farmland into just affecting residential property values more. So it'd be more thoughtful in what sort of energy corridors we're creating through the siting authority. Anyone want to add to that?
Well, this is the point where we get some more conversation and free for all, so feel free to jump in here. So it sounds like we have 5 different potential takeaways on this, 2 kind of related specifically to the land owner issue. One is how we create value for these projects beyond just, returns to landowners whose land is built into the easement system. And also the potential of creating energy corridors that might consolidate, the land impact of different kinds of projects, if I'm understanding that right, Adrian. And then in the other group, one, just having a clear statement of the objective. And I really appreciated this conversation on our small group. And Carrie, you were a big part of that. Maybe you could add to that. We started today thinking about how do we improve regional transmission in some sense in the way we framed the conversation. But is that really the goal? Is the goal regional transmission, or is the goal something else? And regional transmission is one means to an end. And reframing that goal may affect the way we do the decision. Carrie, does that capture what you were saying? Would you want to build on that?
Because for us, we're trying to make this transition, add renewables, add distributed generation, and make sure our system can support that. So that's really the goal. It's not how much transmission can you add, or how much transmission can you add, and do we hope that will bring something. A lot of the ANOPR comments, I think, that were filed, to take this back 2 years, was, or at least from us, was around, utilities or people that construct transmission didn't want to be held accountable for following a FERC process, building out transmission, finding out 15 years from now that those scenarios didn't prevail and that transmission wasn't as useful as we had anticipated, and we'd invested all that money. And I think that's some of the outcomes that we don't really talk about. But so stating the objective, which is, manage the transition, add reliability to the system, those types of outcomes, making that known, regional, interregional, local, all could be a benefit of transmission to make that happen.
Transparency of customer impacts, and then identifying opportunities to introduce certainty into a very uncertain process, I think were the other 2, Sarah, if I got those right. So if that group could share a little bit about, how do we, or how could you envision us creating more transparency on, and how do we introduce certainty into a somewhat uncertain process? What are the thoughts for actually making that happen?
The transparency on customer impact was another one of Carrie's great ideas. So I'll let him go into that one a little more. When I was talking about introducing certainty, that was just because as a regulator, I know our process works better when there is certainty as to a desire or what the outcome is, or the process by, we're moving through, or something like that. And I mean, I would say that knowing that a state siting authority is going to be designating corridors is a type of certainty, perhaps. Okay. Like if I know that a decision-making body has said this strip is what we're looking at, that tells me something about what I'm going to be, well, it tells you whatever it tells you, right? So it could be any number of things. And I pulled into that the stakeholder process, knowing that there has to be a demonstration that you have implemented or not implemented a stakeholder process would provide certainty, knowing what steps you're taking to get from one place to another. But I again, this was just me, so I want to hear everybody else as well.
So the floor is open. Thoughts on any of those ideas or elaboration from anyone for this in the small groups?
So I like the certainty approach because I think that favors everybody, right? Whenever you're working within a process, and if there were a couple things we talked about, the stakeholder engagement, maybe some other policy activities that we say, here's what we're trying to achieve, and all those, anything that adds certainty helps us deliver better, and it helps us measure against what we're trying to achieve. Both of those fit together in that.
Anthony, Blake, Sandra?
I was just going to echo what Carrie said. I spent quite a bit of time in my career working as outside counsel for entities that were looking to ship natural gas on pipelines, and went through a lot of the permitting processes related to pipelines for that reason. And where there was certainty in the regulatory process, the process generally went better, and the results for all parties involved generally were better because there was an understanding of what the expectations were for the project developer, what the processes were that they would go through to engage with the community. And I think that just led to better results. Where there was not certainty, the results, unsurprisingly, were not often as good across the board for all stakeholders. So I just wanted to what they were saying and what the others are agreement about that.
I have a question, I guess. How well does initiatives like the right of first refusal laws help to increase certainty?
You know who gets first bite at the apple, right? I mean, it may not be the policy everybody wants, but I know that if MISO identifies a project that's going to run through NIPSCO's service territory, NIPSCO gets to say what NIPSCO's planning to do, right? And that is a legislative policy advanced by our state. So we have that degree of a type of certainty. But there are policy implications underlining it, right? But Blake, I'll pick on you then, right? Blake knows that he's not going to be part of that mix until NIPSCO takes action. Sorry.
So I'd echo that provides certainty. So first of all, a lot of times the constructors of lines are the same people, right? It's not the people we employ. A lot of times we'll employ contractors to do that. Developers will employ the same contractors. So it's just shifting some of that around. But knowing who's going to do that, you can line up resources. You don't have to put in extra coordination around who maintains versus operates a transmission line that you're trying to maintain reliability over in your balancing area. So there are a lot of factors that the right of first refusal gives you. And when you step outside of that and you say, okay, I'm not going to take that project, we'll open that up, then you know that you're going to make those coordination steps with whoever would build that line and put in place all those things. But it's a little bit simpler to walk through that process in that deliberate order in my mind.
And real quick, maybe it's certainty with an asterisk too, acknowledging the pros and cons that depending on the stakeholder's perspective, right? That
Sure.
Can come with certainty.
Yeah, and I guess it's a question of what certainty are you looking for, right? That may be associated with that. Because ROFRs don't necessarily address, don't give you full certainty on everything, right? And yeah, there is. I know some states legislatively have put in these policies where they think it does provide some benefits back towards the consumers within their states, and that's been the legislative choice of certain states. Other states have promoted the concept of competition and how that will improve and can improve the costs associated with significant investments. And so there can be certainty associated outside of the incumbent the incumbent utility building a specified project. It doesn't necessarily have to be that utility to develop that project in order to give certain other types of certainty that may be important, such as like costs associated with that and getting the projects developed at the least cost, especially where the developer has strong cost caps associated with the development of those transmission projects. And it does take it outside of the traditional model of development for transmission projects, where historically the developer has been the incumbent utility. But there's a lot to be gained too through the competitive processes, where especially I think when you're talking about projects that span more than one incumbent utilities service territory, and there's benefits to be gained. So it's something that each obviously state will have to consider on its own and figure out what may be the best for its constituents. And but there is certainly, and I work for LS Power, so we are a competitive transmission developer, and we think that the policies that allow and promote competition, are conducive to projects getting built and built in a more cost-effective manner.
Anthony, do you have something to jump in on this? Glad to see you on there.
Hi, Commissioner Freeman. Yeah, I'm saying that because I came from Indiana. I'm with the commissioner advocate in Indiana just about a year ago. So I'm in Iowa now. In terms of that, there's been a question behind in the back of my mind. Is like, when you have a utility, the incumbent utility who has the right of first refusal, and if there's like a merchant transmission developer who's willing to put their money on that particular project without saddling, the captured ratepayers, I think it would be a lot helpful if we allow those parties to come in instead of the incumbent utility taking on the responsibility for that investment, and with an assurance that, not a guarantee, assurance that they're going to get their investment back. So I think that's one thing that's the back of our mind, like, well, why can't we allow other developers to come in and put their money where they think they can get a return from it without putting the burden on ratepayers.
That's certainly a good question for the policy discussion. As Commissioner Freeman said, that this ultimately comes up to being a policy issue in most states. But yeah, that's, yeah, I've always been curious about these ROFR rules. My background is kind of on the economics of contracting, and when I think right of first refusal in economics in those transaction settings, it has a very specific kind of value add to a transaction and kind of marking it to market in a sense. But when we're using it as a pre-bid or pre-investment rule, I still wrestle a little bit with how that works and what the economic implications are. So, Carrie's comments and Blake's comments and your comments, Anthony, I think those kind of triangulate on hitting on some of the different margins of that. So this is really helpful for me on that particular issue. So, that's one of those policy questions as we think about doing this is, how do we implement development once we recognize the need with, who gets first bite at the apple, as Commissioner Freeman said earlier, and how that affects the way projects are developed over time is perhaps an interesting part of this.
I might be going back on a previous topic about designated corridors. I kind of noticed, I mean, now that I've been in two states and I've seen how transmission lines or the build out of transmission lines. And I was wondering, because states has the authority for siting, and I was wondering whether it would be helpful for states actually establishing transmission line, designated transmission line corridors where, there's already a 745 line that goes north and south, and also east and west that traverses the state. Now there's an existing transmission line, and now you have another utility who's coming in. Instead of building a parallel transmission line on greenfield, they can just like, hey, there's already established transmission line that's being owned by a different utility, but since it's a designated transmission corridor by the state, I can actually build on that. And with, transmission line design now, you're not limited into like, hey, this line is utility A, this line is utility B. It's more like a technical engineering problem rather than building new lines across greenfields. When I say greenfield, farmlands, here in Iowa, farmlands are very, very valuable. And I know Commissioner Freeman, I've tasted one of the best corns in Indiana, but I will tell you, try the Iowa corn. Oh my God. I mean, I've tasted corn across the world, from Asia, from different parts of the world. And I got to Indiana, corn is really nice. But please, if you have the chance, try Iowa corn.
As long as you don't say their tomatoes are better.
Yeah, sure, just try it. And, they have what they call a peaches and something corn, and it's just delightful corn. But that's my idea, that since the state has the siting authority, if possible, they can designate, energy corridor, transmission line where build outs can follow that. They know where generation is going to be put in place. Like here, renewables, we know wind is pretty strong in the northwest of Iowa, and just anything that's north of Iowa. So, build out could happen that way. Just a thought,
I have a question to your comment. Would the energy transmission corridor, or would the energy corridor be extended to pipelines and other services?
I'm kind of wondering about that, because the way I understand pipelines, if you have a pipeline, you can actually run oil from different companies. They just put I think what they call a peg in there that kind of separate different types. But that's oil. Well, transmission lines is electrons is electro utility A is the same as utility B. So it's more like, hey, if we have this corridor, just imagine a 745 kV with the structure that was built in the 1960s and 70s. You could see how wide the right of way it occupies, and it cuts through these farmlands. And I was looking at these structures. I mean, like with new construction technologies, you can build so many lines in there, given the same footprint. But right now, that footprint is only being occupied by one utility, couple of circuits that could have been very advantageous if other utilities can also build in the same area instead of building a parallel line. That's just my idea.
Terry, I was wondering, can you speak to that kind of from the engineering and technology side at the electric company?
Well, so, I mean, if it was about co-locating, frequently we don't like to co-locate gas lines and transmission lines because can damage structures in some cases. The other thing I would say about corridors, they can be effective, and I think we all try to use that. But too much dependence on corridors also adds risk, because if weather comes through, you lose 7 lines instead of 1 line or something of that nature. So you've got to balance that out, and each system is different. So the problem, you know, if you were starting from scratch and rebuilding a system, you could think through all these things, but every system, and even regionally, were built on top of where we were. Where was the load center? Where was generation? Where was the new generation? Where's new load? How do I need to connect that with transmission? So they're all kind of independent, but there are some risks with the corridor concept, some benefits too. I know it's not a great answer, but it is going to be more region specific.
And as we think about, you know, I picked up on Anthony's comment that maybe even thinking about multiple utilities being in the same corridor, I just think about collective action problems, right? And, you know, who's free riding on whose initial investment, and what incentive does that create for the initial investor as you think about splitting costs down the road and how those returns get recaptured down the road. I mean, I can see the appeal of it and see some of the benefits, but I could administratively and just kind of economically, I can see some issues that way aside from just the technical issues.
Well, and some investment things. Some old guys like me still remember when we were opening up transmission access that we were concerned of migration. Customers invested in this, and then other customers got the benefit of it. And so those customer migration issues are always still available.
This is just an exercise in, let's say you have a 745 kV line, you know, with new technologies like a high voltage DC underground. And just imagine you have a 745 kV overhead line, and then you can just drill down underneath that 745 and run like a high voltage DC. It will not affect that 745. It will not affect anything, but basically you're not encumbering new land to be able to host that transmission line. So that's the idea. I'm saying, like, you know, yeah, you're going to have a problem when you have another 745 line, reconfigure 745 lines. But what I'm thinking more about the future, new technology coming in and allowing this new technology, instead of breaking new grounds, use what you have in place. And I'm not thinking about, you know, all your transmission line is going to be designated as an energy corridor. It's just like the state pinpointing, okay, we have this major corridor going north to south and another one going east to west. And just designate those things as your corridor. So now it's very easy. It will be a lot easier, I think, to be able to build out a north and south line instead of, you know, going through another greenfield or an east to west corridor paralleling what you already have.
It's a very good thought.
Well, we are coming up on the end of the time we had set aside for this. The last few minutes was really just for wrap up, but I think, this conversation has done a very nice job of pulling the day together, and I really appreciate those of you that have stuck around. Any last thoughts as we wrap up?
I also want to thank everyone for sticking around. Mike and I are teaching a class in the spring, and your stories and information are really helpful in adding some real life examples to those classes. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah. I'll throw the plug out there. If any of you are interested in being a guest lecturer sometime next semester, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, between 9 and 10, we would be happy to have you zoom into the classroom and share some of your experiences. Just send us an email. We'd be happy to have you do that.
And I want to echo all of that appreciation, but also share my gratitude with Dr. Sakuda and Dr. Oler for taking a little bit of a leap of faith on this format. It's a new one for us with our Hot Topic Hotline webinar series, but I enjoyed it today, and we just will continue learning about how best to get educational materials out there to everybody.
And thank you. As long as we're doing this circuitously, thank you, Commissioner Freeman. Commissioner Freeman is one of the co-chairs of our Hot Topic Hotlines committee that inspired this event, and we certainly appreciate you being here and helping with that. As Adrian alluded to, our hope, and as I mentioned earlier on, our hope is to generate some kind of a white paper or follow-up out of today's activities that summarizes the conversation we've had, these takeaway points that you've put in place or that you've offered us today. And we'll be working on getting that out and circulated through our website. It's fri.missouri.edu. Today's program, as you've seen, has been recorded, except for the breakout sessions themselves. So that video will be hanging on our YouTube channel sometime soon. The YouTube channel is FRI-MIZZOU. So you can go back and catch up on what you may have missed. We point some of your colleagues to it to come and see what we talked about and see what further conversations we may have down the road. But with that, I greatly appreciate the time you've invested in today, the way you commit yourselves to these industries and the value you bring to our industries and our society as a result, because we couldn't do and live the life we lead without access to affordable, resilient, reliable electricity, as well as our other utilities. And you all in your various roles play an important role with that. So thank you all for what you do. Thank you for being with us today. And I wish you well and hope you're enjoying as pleasant a autumn day as we are here in mid-Missouri. And hope you get a chance to see some sunlight before it goes away. So thank you.
Bye, everybody. Good to see you, Anthony. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.